Hello, my dear friends. In the heart of Georgian London, thousands were quietly destroying themselves with a poison sold in every pharmacy, a medicine disguised as a miracle. Laudanum crept into bedrooms, nurseries, and parlours, consumed by the rich, the poor, women, men, and even infants. It dulled pain, blurred minds, and hollowed out bodies. Yet no one dared call it addiction. Families hid the bottles, doctors kept prescribing, and society looked the other way as a century of silence engulfed its victims. Tonight, step inside this hidden world and witness the life of a laudanum addict. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone in Georgian London felt unwell, whether it was a lady sitting in her drawing room or a man coming home from the workshop, there was one bottle that seemed to be in every house. It was laudanum. People thought of it as medicine, not as poison. The tiny glass bottles were sold openly in shops across the city. It was so common that even people who had little money could afford a small dose. Laudanum was a mixture of alcohol and opium. It dulled pain, eased sleep, and silenced children. It was a solution for everything. And that was why it became part of daily life. Among the wealthy, laudanum was considered elegant. A lady of status might keep a bottle near her bedside or in a small cabinet by the dining room. When she felt nervous, dizzy, or simply bored, she would take a spoonful. The doctors of the time often told women that laudanum was good for calming the nerves. The women themselves came to believe that life without it was too difficult. For them, the habit began as comfort. They might drink tea with friends in the afternoon and then excuse themselves to sip laudanum in private. No one thought badly of it. In fact, many thought it showed refinement. It is almost funny that what passed for elegance back then would today be compared to someone carrying a pocket full of painkillers everywhere they go. Workers also used laudanum. A man who spent all day lifting, hammering, or working by the river might come home with his muscles sore and his back in agony. He could not afford a long rest. He had to keep working the next day. Laudanum gave him temporary relief. He could drink a little before bed, sleep soundly, and wake up ready to force himself back to the same labor. For him, it was not about elegance or refinement. It was survival. Laudanum dulled the sharp pain and let him push through. The men who drank it did not call themselves addicts. They said they were just trying to keep their bodies moving long enough to feed their families. The use of laudanum did not stop with adults. Parents gave it to babies. A crying child was exhausting, and in homes where there were many children, constant crying meant no rest for anyone. Laudanum became a tool to silence infants. A few drops on the tongue could quiet a baby for hours. Bottles marketed directly for children even had soft names, suggesting comfort and safety. Some were called soothing syrups. They promised peace in a noisy house. The reality was that babies were being drugged to sleep. Some survived it, others did not. Small bodies could not handle what adults were pouring into them. Yet parents trusted what was sold to them, and no one stopped the trade. If we compare it to now, it would be like walking into a modern pharmacy and seeing bottles of morphine syrup sitting on the shelf next to cough drops. The acceptance of laudanum across classes is striking. In one street, a wealthy woman in silk drank it for her nerves. In the same street, her dock worker used it to ease his aching bones. In another home, a baby was given drops so the family could sleep. No one thought of it as dangerous. Instead, it was praised. Newspapers carried advertisements. Apothecaries displayed bottles in their windows. Laudanum was everywhere, in every circle, from the polished drawing rooms to the dim alleys. I cannot help but think that if I lived in that time, I too might have reached for it without questioning what it really was. This wide reach meant that laudanum was not hidden. People used it openly. Guests at a party might notice their hostess excusing herself to take a sip. A tired father might share with his friend that a few drops had helped him sleep despite his sore back. Mothers discussed how much they gave to their babies, comparing amounts like they were sharing recipes. The normalization of it erased any sense of caution. Addiction was not a word used in polite society. Weakness was the word they used. They believed some people simply had frail bodies that needed more rest. Laudanum, they thought, was a remedy, not a danger. The bottles themselves were easy to recognize. Dark glass, carefully sealed and labeled with elegant lettering. Some were small enough to fit in a pocket. Others stood tall on the shelves of a grand home. They were not treated as shameful objects. They were placed next to other medicines, like powders for stomach aches or syrups for coughs. A visitor opening a cabinet might see them and think nothing of it. They were part of ordinary life. The cost was another reason for its popularity. Laudanum was cheaper than hiring a doctor for repeated visits. For a working family, one bottle could last weeks and serve many purposes. For a wealthy household, it was part of the regular supplies, like tea or sugar. Everyone could reach it. Everyone could buy it. That kind of access meant that more and more people relied on it, until it became normal to assume that life could not be managed without it. The city itself carried signs of its presence. Apothecaries thrived. Some streets had multiple shops selling bottles to whoever asked. There were no restrictions on age or reason. A child could walk in and buy it if they had the money. Vendors saw no harm in selling it to anyone. It was business. The demand was high, and the supply kept growing. Georgian London learned to live with laudanum, not as a hidden vice but as a visible habit. Over time, habits turned into needs. A woman who started taking laudanum for sleepless nights might discover she could no longer face the day without it. A man who once took it only after hard labor might begin using it every evening. A baby given laudanum would grow up in a body shaped by it. This cycle spread through families and neighborhoods, quietly but firmly. It was the start of a society where dependence was invisible because it was so widespread. What makes this story disturbing is not only the presence of laudanum but the acceptance of it. It was trusted, it was respected, it was used without hesitation. People in Georgian London believed they were managing their lives with the help of medicine. In reality, they were tying themselves to a bottle that would not let them go. The truth was that laudanum did not heal. It only covered pain, delayed discomfort, and created a deeper need. The image of a city where everyone, from the highest lady to the smallest child, shared the same bottle shows how fully laudanum had entered daily life. It crossed boundaries of wealth, class, and age. It did not discriminate. That universality is what made it both accepted and dangerous. People thought it was uniting them in relief, but in truth, it was binding them in quiet chains. As the story of laudanum continues, it becomes clear that what began as a harmless solution was setting the stage for something far darker, where relief turned into dependence, and dependence turned into ruin. The story of laudanum in Georgian London cannot be told without explaining how it was first accepted as a cure for almost everything. People of that time did not look at the bottle with suspicion. They saw it as a trusted remedy, no different from how we might keep a jar of aspirin or a packet of cold medicine today. When a person walked into an apothecary, they did not need to give reasons or prescriptions. They could simply ask for laudanum, and they would receive it, measured out in neat glass bottles. For the sellers, it was business. For the buyers, it was health. The shelves of chemists were lined with bottles that promised relief from all sorts of discomforts, headaches, stomach cramps, sleeplessness, and even sadness could be treated with laudanum. Advertisements were printed in newspapers, calling it a safe and reliable answer. Physicians endorsed it freely. Some wrote notes suggesting a spoonful before bed. Others recommended it after meals. It was described as gentle, soothing, and effective. Families believed it was their shield against illness. Looking back, it is almost laughable that people trusted a liquid filled with opium as casually as if it were peppermint water. Women suffering from what doctors then called hysteria were encouraged to drink laudanum. Men who felt restless after long days were told the same. Children who would not sleep at night were given drops. There was no distinction between serious sickness and ordinary discomfort. Laudanum was presented as the cure for both. A person grieving a loss might be told to take it to soften their sorrow. A woman with menstrual pain would take it to relax her body. The boundaries between medicine and mood were blurred. The bottle was meant to fix it all. The strange comfort came from its flexibility. Laudanum could be used as a sedative, a painkiller, or even an emotional crutch. Because it contained both alcohol and opium, its effects were quick. A few drops made one drowsy, more drops silenced deeper pain, and larger doses placed the user into a heavy sleep. Doctors often wrote vague instructions such as take as needed. This open-ended guidance meant that patients decided for themselves how much to use. Over time, many increased the dose, not because they sought pleasure, but because the first effects no longer worked. What made laudanum different from other medicines was its reach. There was no clear group of people who avoided it. The rich used it to maintain calm. The poor used it to carry on with hard lives. Parents used it on children. Elders relied on it to ease the aches of age. In the medical world, no disease seemed too great or too small for laudanum. This general acceptance created an environment where dependency was invisible. If everyone used it, how could it be called a problem in our modern world? It would be as if strong narcotics were handed out like basic vitamins, accepted as ordinary and even expected. The market for laudanum grew steadily. Apothecaries found that customers returned quickly for more. They ordered larger supplies from manufacturers. The cycle was steady and profitable. The reputation of laudanum as a universal cure meant that few questioned its risks. Instead, its presence gave families a sense of security. To them, having a bottle on hand was proof that they were prepared for any illness. It was like keeping bread in the pantry or coal by the hearth. The thought of being without it was unsettling. This habit did not come only from ignorance. It came from trust in authority. When priests spoke of healing, when doctors wrote prescriptions, when newspapers published glowing accounts, ordinary people listened. They did not have the knowledge to question chemical contents or long-term consequences. They only knew that laudanum seemed to work, and that respected men said it was safe. I sometimes think that if I had been born in that period, I too would have trusted the words of doctors and reached for laudanum without hesitation. The lack of control was striking. No law limited its sale. No warning labels were placed on the bottles. The same substance that could knock a man unconscious for hours was sold with fewer restrictions than bread or ale. Children could fetch it for their parents. Servants could buy it for their masters. People spoke about it openly, without shame or secrecy. It was simply there, like candles or soap, a normal item in every home. The silence around its dangers was not born from fear, but from ignorance. Laudanum also became tied to identity. Some women were known for their delicate health, always needing a sip before bed. Some men were known for being able to drink more without appearing drunk. These small reputations became part of social life. People joked lightly about who needed more and who needed less. Behind the jokes was a hidden truth: their bodies were slowly being reshaped by constant use. They could not stop, yet they did not see themselves as weak. They saw themselves as simply managing life. The idea of laudanum as a cure-all did not fade quickly. It lasted across generations. Parents who had been given laudanum as children gave it to their children. The pattern repeated itself. It was not seen as an addiction, but as a tradition. In that repetition, dependence was passed down like an heirloom. Families carried bottles in trunks when they moved. Soldiers carried it when they traveled. It followed people through every stage of life, from birth to death. By the late Georgian period, the use of laudanum was woven into the very fabric of society. It was not only a drug, it was a habit of culture. The marble houses of the rich and the crowded rooms of the poor both held the same dark liquid. It shaped how people dealt with pain, sadness, and fatigue. It was medicine in their eyes, but poison in truth. The contradiction remained unseen. The reality was that laudanum's reputation as a cure for everything created a city that was quietly dependent, even before the word dependence was widely used. People lived in its shadow without recognizing the danger. They thought they were healed, but in reality, they were bound. The idea that one liquid could answer every problem is what made laudanum both trusted and terrifying. What becomes clear next is how quickly this so-called cure slipped into daily routines, turning medicine into habit and habit into silent chains. Laudanum did not spread evenly across society by chance. Some groups relied on it far more heavily than others, and among the most visible were the women who sold their bodies on the streets and the artists who filled the city with music, poems, and stories. Both groups lived close to the edge of exhaustion. They turned to laudanum because it promised to take the edge off life. What they had in common was not wealth or privilege, but the constant pressure of survival, whether through the harshness of the body trade or the torment of creativity. The women who walked the streets at night faced lives that were often short and filled with pain. They had few choices. Work was scarce for poor women, and many ended up selling themselves because there was no other way to eat or to keep a roof overhead. The nights were cold, the encounters were rough, and violence was common. Their bodies carried bruises, illnesses, and fatigue. Laudanum became their shield. A few spoonfuls dulled the aches and blurred the memory of what they endured. It gave them distance from the reality of their work. Some women drank it before meeting a client, others after. But in either case it became routine. It is grimly ironic that a drug sold as medicine became the daily armor of women whose society refused to protect. Artists turned to the same bottle, but for reasons that seemed more refined in the eyes of the public. Musicians, painters, and writers often spoke of laudanum as if it unlocked a door in their minds. They described how it helped them stay awake at night, following a thread of thought or melody. They claimed it soothed their nerves when inspiration would not come. They believed it removed barriers, allowing imagination to flow freely. In reality, the drug clouded their senses, making them drift between waking and sleeping states. Out of this fog, they sometimes pulled strange and vivid ideas that later appeared in their work. Audiences admired their brilliance without seeing the bottle that sat on their desks. If we looked at it from a modern perspective, it would be like discovering that half the most famous songs and novels of a city were written while their creators were sedated with narcotics. The two groups, prostitutes and artists, could not have seemed more different when passing each other in the streets. One group was seen as shameful, the other as admirable. Yet both clutched the same brown glass bottles. Both found relief in the same mixture of opium and alcohol. For the women, it was escape. For the artists, it was inspiration. Society condemned one and praised the other, but the effect of the drug was the same. Dependence grew silently in both worlds. I find it difficult not to feel that the judgment placed on these groups said more about class and reputation than about the drug itself. In taverns and hidden rooms, prostitutes sometimes drank laudanum together, sharing bottles like others might share bread. They laughed louder when the effect set in, or they grew quiet and heavy-eyed, leaning against walls until clients arrived. Their lives had little softness, and laudanum filled the gap. For them, there was no medical advice, no careful measure. They poured and drank until the pain faded. Some grew pale and thin quickly, their health sliding away. Others died young, their bodies already worn out before the drug claimed them fully. In candlelit studies, writers sat with quills in hand, dipping into laudanum when words would not come. They romanticized their habit. They spoke of visions, of heightened senses, of traveling to other realms of thought. Their letters and diaries sometimes revealed how deep the habit ran, though often cloaked in elegant words. The truth was less glamorous. They were caught in the same cycle as the women in the streets, taking more as the effect of the last dose wore off, chasing relief for a spark of energy that seemed harder to reach without the drug. The only difference was that when artists destroyed themselves with laudanum, society called it genius. The visibility of laudanum among these groups influenced others. Patrons of art saw respected figures using it and assumed it must be acceptable. Men visiting prostitutes sometimes noticed bottles on shelves or by the bed but thought nothing of it, as if it was soap or water. The normality spread, reinforcing the idea that laudanum was harmless or even useful. What was hidden was the damage, the bodies of women wasting away, the minds of artists unraveling, the dependence deepening with each drop. None of this appeared in the polished image society preferred to hold. The connection between creativity and laudanum became so strong that some young artists began using it deliberately, hoping it would make them more talented. They mistook the haze for brilliance. They copied the habits of their idols, not realizing they were stepping into the same trap. Meanwhile, prostitutes introduced new girls to laudanum as part of the routine, telling them it would make the nights easier to endure. The cycle renewed itself in both groups. Dependence passed like an unspoken lesson. The strange truth is that two groups at opposite ends of society, one celebrated and one despised, found themselves bound by the same quiet addiction. Laudanum became the hidden thread linking music, poetry, and art to the most desperate trade in the streets. It blurred class lines while reinforcing hypocrisy, for people admired the artist and condemned the prostitute, though both relied on the same drug. The belief that laudanum could inspire or protect only made the trap tighter, drawing in more lives with the promise of relief or brilliance. What comes next is how this widespread use began to leave marks on the body itself, changing the faces, the skin, and even the breath of those who could not put the bottle down. The presence of laudanum in the lives of women was not only widespread but also deeply hidden. On the surface, many of them carried themselves with the grace expected in Georgian London. They went out for walks in fine dresses. They greeted neighbours politely, and they arranged their hair and painted their faces before appearing in public. Behind this routine, their bodies and minds were tangled in a struggle that few could see. Laudanum had become part of their daily rhythm, but the signs of dependence were masked by silk and powder. In social gatherings, a woman might seem composed. She would sip tea, exchange remarks about the weather, and keep her posture straight. No one would suspect that only an hour earlier, she had taken laudanum to quiet her shaking hands or her restless heart. The drug gave her the strength to move through the day, but it also hollowed her out. When the effect wore off, anxiety returned. The cycle repeated again and again. It is strangely ironic that society admired these women for their elegance, when much of that appearance was held together by a bottle of opium and alcohol. The pressure on women to appear calm and dignified made laudanum even more attractive. Public life demanded composure, while private life often meant exhaustion. Many women were expected to manage households, raise children, and maintain social appearances all at once. When they felt faint, nervous, or sad, laudanum was recommended. Doctors even encouraged its use, calling it a gentle remedy for female troubles. It was prescribed for menstrual pain, sleeplessness, or what they vaguely called hysteria. The fact that it dulled emotion was seen as proof that it worked. No one considered the cost, but the cost was high. Over time, the constant use of laudanum disrupted the natural rhythm of the body. Heartbeats became irregular. Women complained of dizziness and trembling. Some miscarried, their pregnancies unable to survive the strain. Others found their cycles disrupted until they stopped altogether. Families whispered about weak constitutions, not realizing the real cause was the very medicine trusted to make women well. If we put it in modern terms, it would be like a society where doctors casually handed out strong opioids for every cramp or restless night, ignoring the long-term damage while insisting it was harmless. Women rarely spoke of these struggles openly, Silence was part of their role. To complain too much was to risk being labelled dramatic or unstable. So they endured quietly, taking laudanum behind closed doors, smiling in public while their bodies grew weaker. The secrecy did not mean shame. It meant survival. They believed they had no choice but to continue. Their lives were arranged around the bottle, from the moment they woke to the time they lay down at night. The calm expression on their faces hid a dependence that was consuming them. In the quiet hours of the morning, some women measured out drops before facing the day. At night, they took more to fall asleep. Servants noticed but said little. Husbands sometimes knew but looked the other way, as long as the household ran smoothly. Children grew up seeing their mothers pale and weary, not understanding the cause. What looked like fragility was in fact the mark of constant drugging. I cannot help but think that many of these women might have lived longer, healthier lives if they had been offered rest, kindness, or true medicine, instead of a bottle that only deepened their suffering. The cultural expectation of control over female emotion fed the cycle. A woman who showed anger or despair was judged harshly. Laudanum softened those feelings, turning visible distress into silence. In that sense, the drug served not only the women but also the society that preferred them subdued. Calm wives and mothers were easier to accept, even if the calm was manufactured. The reality was a generation of women living in muted tones, their emotions dulled and their health collapsing. The toll showed itself gradually: pale skin, tired eyes, trembling hands, and sudden fainting became common descriptions in letters and diaries. Friends might remark gently on how delicate a woman had become. Rarely did anyone connect this fragility to laudanum. Instead, it was attributed to the natural weakness of women. The drug was seen as a support, not the cause. This misunderstanding allowed dependence to deepen without challenge. Inside the privacy of their rooms, the struggle was harder to hide. Women sometimes increased their doses when the usual amount no longer eased the discomfort. They found themselves unable to function without it. The nervous energy that once drove them to social duties was replaced by sluggishness. Yet they continued, because to stop meant facing unbearable withdrawal. The habit bound them as tightly as any chain, though no one saw it that way. Some women suffered in silence until their deaths. They slipped away young, their bodies too frail to endure the strain. Families mourned without realizing that the medicine they trusted had hastened the end. Others lived longer but with constant ill health, drifting between states of numbness and agitation. These stories were rarely told openly. They remained in the background, hidden behind the walls of fine houses and respectable facades. The image of women walking in bright dresses while carrying the invisible weight of laudanum shows how dependence could exist quietly in plain sight. It was not a scandal, not a whispered sin, but an ordinary fact of life. Their beauty and dignity were preserved outwardly while their inner strength eroded. The reality that a trusted medicine quietly undermined the health of so many women makes the silence around it even more striking. What follows is how the children of these households, especially infants, were drawn into the AIM cycle, given drops of laudanum to quiet their cries before they could even speak. The story of laudanum in Georgian London would not be complete without looking at the way it touched the very youngest lives. Infants, who had no choice and no voice, were given drops of the same mixture that adults use to steady their nerves and dull their pain. Mothers, already tired from the demands of work, house duties, and sometimes their dependence on the drug, often turned to laudanum as an answer for sleepless nights filled with the cries of a baby. It was easy to reach for the bottle, and no one warned them of the danger. The practice became so common that entire products were designed around it. One of the most notorious was a syrup called Godfrey's Cordial. It was sold specifically for infants and children. Advertisements promised that it would soothe the restlessness, stop crying, and bring peace to households. Apothecaries displayed it proudly, and parents bought it with relief. Inside the bottle, however, was laudanum mixed with other ingredients. The effect was strong enough to knock a baby into long hours of unnatural sleep. It is a dark kind of humor to realize that what was marketed as a soothing cordial was, in truth, a sedative powerful enough to silence even the most restless infant. In crowded homes, where many children lived together in small spaces, the sound of crying could wear down entire families. Mothers, desperate for a moment of quiet, reached for Godfrey's cordial or simply diluted laudanum to give to their babies. Servants sometimes administered it when parents were absent. Neighbors shared recipes for the right amount, as if it were nothing more serious than tea. Few understood that they were exposing tiny bodies to a substance that even adults struggle to manage. The babies often slept for hours, giving mothers the rest they needed, but the cost was hidden inside their fragile systems. Doctors of the time rarely raised concerns. They prescribed laudanum for infants as freely as they did for adults. If a child was sickly, restless, or had trouble digesting food, laudanum was suggested. They believed it calmed the body, not realizing that it was suppressing vital functions. As a result, entire generations of infants were exposed to the drug in their earliest months of life. For many, it became a repeated part of their daily care. If we compare it to today, it would be like putting bottles of morphine cough syrup in the baby aisle of a supermarket, complete with smiling labels and cheerful instructions. The consequences were severe. Some babies developed constant lethargy. They no longer cried as loudly, no longer responded with energy, and seemed weaker as weeks went by. Others suffered from digestive troubles or shallow breathing. A number of infants never woke up after being given too much. Death certificates often listed vague causes such as failure to thrive or sudden illness, hiding the role laudanum played. Families grieved without ever realizing that the medicine they trusted was the very thing that had taken their children. For the babies who survived, the effects could last into childhood. Some grew dependent, their small bodies adjusting to regular doses of laudanum. Others suffered developmental problems, their growth slowed by the sedative effect. The cries of infants had always been nature's way of demanding care, but laudanum muted those cries. The silence seemed like peace, but it was in truth a warning of harm. Parents mistook quietness for health, when it was instead the stillness of a drugged child. I cannot help but feel that this silence must have haunted some mothers later, when they realized that the peace they longed for had been bought at the cost of their child's strength. The availability of these products showed how far society had normalized laudanum. Bottles marketed for babies were placed alongside those for adults. There was no line between safe and unsafe, no distinction between ages. Families used it without thinking, as if it were a simple household remedy. The cycle of dependence began before a child could even walk or talk. The first taste of laudanum entered their mouths before they could form memories, tying them to a substance that would shape their lives long before they understood what it was. Accounts from the time describe households where every member, from the grandmother to the youngest infant, consumed laudanum in some form. It was not shocking to anyone. It was normal. Mothers who had been given laudanum as children continued the practice with their babies. They passed the habit down as naturally as they passed down recipes or traditions. This unbroken chain ensured that laudanum remained not only a medicine but a family custom. The saddest part of the story is that the harm was preventable, but prevention required knowledge, and that knowledge did not exist. Families trusted what they were told. Apothecaries did not question their sales. Doctors did not research the consequences. In this silence, infants suffered the most. Their lives began with dependence, and in many cases ended with it. Society accepted their deaths as natural tragedies, never connecting them to the bottle in the cupboard. The image of mothers rocking babies to sleep after giving them laudanum shows how innocence and dependence were woven together from the start. The trust of parents, the helplessness of infants, and the careless freedom of apothecaries created a system where the youngest paid the highest price. The reality that an entire market was built around drugging children should unsettle us, even centuries later. What follows is how laudanum became not only a family habit, but also the structure of daily life, with people waking, eating, and sleeping according to the doses they consumed. The daily rhythm of a person dependent on laudanum always began with the same thought: how to take the first dose before the body collapsed. For many in Georgian London, the morning did not start with bread or porridge, nor with the bustle of servants preparing a meal. It began with the reach of a hand toward a dark bottle. The body, having endured the night in uneasy sleep, woke with tremors, sweats, and waves of anxiety, before any work could be faced, before any conversation could be made. The dropper or spoon touched the lips. This was how the day was set in motion. The first sip was often mixed with tea. Some diluted the laudanum in hot water, hoping to soften its bitter taste. Others swallowed it straight, too desperate to care about flavor. Breakfast was not important, for food felt heavy in the stomach of a body already dulled. Many went without eating, finding that the drug was enough to carry them through the early hours. What mattered was avoiding the storm that came when the night's dose faded. If too much time passed, the shivering grew worse, and the body's cries became unbearable. Men and women alike learned to time their mornings around this ritual. Servants in wealthier houses sometimes poured the liquid before their masters even stirred, just as naturally as they would draw the curtains or light the fire. Workers in smaller homes kept bottles close to their bedsides, so they could drink before their feet touched the floor. The moment of waking was the most dangerous. Without laudanum, the body seized control, demanding more. The drug was no longer a choice. It was the key to standing up and moving at all. It is oddly comical to imagine that what some called their morning tonic was in truth the same thing that left them unable to rise from bed without it. After the first sip, calmness returned, though it was not the natural calm of a healthy person. It was a fragile balance, created by chemicals. The heart slowed, the hands stopped trembling, and the mind steadied. Many describe the sensation not as joy, but as the removal of fear. Normality itself became rare. It was not happiness they sought, but stability. A body without laudanum felt like a prison, while a body with it felt like a borrowed peace. In that strange exchange, the morning dose became sacred. Without it, nothing else could begin. Work and daily tasks were all scheduled according to the next dose. A man who had to leave for labor drank before walking out the door. A woman who needed to meet friends or manage her household drank before putting on her gown. Even children given laudanum by their mothers began their days this way, unknowingly shaped by routine dependence. The bottle was as central to mornings as the sun itself. Everyone in the household knew it, even if no one admitted it aloud. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like families keeping strong narcotics beside the sugar and tea, starting every day with chemicals instead of breakfast. Through the late morning, many felt an uneasy balance. The drug kept them steady enough to function, yet it dulled appetite, clouded thought, and slowed the body. People stumbled through chores or work, not with energy but with a heavy calm. Letters from the time describe women fainting suddenly in parlours, men drifting into half-sleep at workbenches, and children appearing far too quiet for their age. All of this was accepted as normal fragility or natural temperament. The truth was far more direct. The drug governed the pace of life. For those who were wealthier, the morning dose was often disguised with elegance. It might be poured from a polished bottle, measured with silver spoons, and spoken of in gentle terms. For the poor, it was swallowed quickly, often from chipped glass, with little ceremony. But in both settings, the dependence was identical. The city's social classes looked different on the outside, but laudanum erased many differences once the morning dose was taken. I often feel that the most haunting part of this history is how dependence looked refined in one home and desperate in another. Yet in truth, it was the same weakness. As the hours passed, the need grew again. The body remembered the bottle and sent warnings in the form of headaches, shivers, or a restless stomach. Many people carried small containers when they left home, so they could sip during the day. Mothers tucked it into baskets, workers hid it in pockets, and even students brought it to lessons. The fear of being caught without laudanum was greater than the fear of being caught using it. Everyone who depended on it knew that a single missed dose could ruin the entire day. By midday, meals were often skipped, appetite was low, and food seemed less important than keeping balance with the drug. Some tried to eat, but nausea followed. Families noticed patterns but said little. They believed in delicate constitutions or sensitive nerves, not addiction. The language of medicine at the time had no words for what was happening. People thought they were caring for themselves when in truth they were binding themselves tighter with each sip. Children raised in these homes grew up watching mornings shaped by laudanum. They saw their parents or relatives begin the day with a dose, and they learned without being told that this was normal. Some were given drops themselves when restless, reinforcing the cycle from birth. The rhythm of a household became the rhythm of laudanum. Morning, midday, evening, and night were no longer measured by the clock alone but by the bottle. The idea of a normal morning without laudanum faded from memory. For the addicted, life before the drug no longer seemed real. They forgot what it felt like to wake with energy or to eat without nausea. The drug defined their sense of time, comfort, and survival. Every day repeated itself. The same beginning, the same needs. It was a cycle without exit. The image of mornings ruled not by sunlight or breakfast, but by the need for laudanum shows how deeply dependence reshaped the daily life of Georgian London. People started their days not with hope, but with fear of what would happen without the drug. The reality that stability itself became a rare luxury explains why laudanum tightened its grip so quickly across every class and age. What follows is the description of how these bodies, bound to the morning dose, began to reveal visible changes in their faces, skin, and breath, turning dependence into a mark that others could see even from a distance. When the morning dose of laudanum was delayed or missed, the body of the addict began to turn against itself. What started as a slight unease quickly grew into waves of torment. The stomach twisted in sharp cramps that seemed to fold the body inward. The head pounded as if pressed by an unseen weight. The arms and legs shook without control. Each moment without the drug stretched into an ordeal that felt endless. This was not a sickness in the usual sense. It was the body's demand for the substance that had become its master. The bowels rebelled first. Cramping tightened the muscles until people doubled over, clutching their stomachs. Vomiting often followed, leaving them drained and pale. The head throbbed, heavy and dizzy. Sleep was impossible, and rest offered no comfort. Sweat poured down the skin even in cool rooms. Rashes and hives sometimes appeared, showing how the body was fighting itself. The shakes grew so strong that cups fell from hands and pens dropped from fingers. Families saw loved ones in these states and called them weak, not realizing that they were watching withdrawal. It is cruelly absurd that what they thought of as frailty or bad nerves was simply the natural reaction to being denied opium. The mind did not escape these torments. Anxiety swelled into panic. Small noises startled them. Thoughts raced in circles. Some wept openly, unable to stop. Others screamed into pillows or clawed at their skin. The craving for laudanum burned so strongly that nothing else mattered. All sense of dignity disappeared. People begged silently inside themselves for the bottle. The drug had reshaped their brains so deeply that absence felt like death itself approaching. Doctors at the time rarely recognized these symptoms as withdrawal. They described them as nervous conditions, fevers, or fits. Families accepted those words and nodded, even while seeing the pattern repeat whenever the drug was withheld. The idea that a respected medicine could enslave the body was beyond their imagination. Instead of removing the drug, they increased it, trying to soothe the visible pain. The result was a cycle that deepened year after year, as bodies learned to collapse more violently whenever laudanum was missing. The physical spectacle of withdrawal was impossible to ignore in shared homes. In small rooms, neighbours could hear the cries. Servants in wealthier houses noticed when their masters sweated through linens or thrashed at night. Yet silence was maintained. Respectability demanded that no one speak of such things beyond the household. The cries were treated as private suffering, not a public problem. If we think about it with modern eyes, it would be like entire neighbourhoods hearing the pain of addiction, but choosing to believe it was nothing more than an ordinary illness. Children saw their parents or relatives writhing and trembling. They grew used to the sight, though they did not understand it. Some thought that sickness was simply part of adulthood. Others learned to fetch bottles quickly, becoming unwilling assistants in the cycle. Their young minds formed early lessons about dependence, lessons that would follow them into their own lives. The pattern of addiction was passed down not only through blood but through daily example. The length of these withdrawal fits varied. Some lasted hours, others stretched for days if the drug remained unavailable. The longer it went, the worse the symptoms became. Convulsions shook bodies until exhaustion made them collapse. Sleep was restless, filled with jerks and cries. The body fought to rid itself of laudanum, but the mind refused to allow it. The conflict was relentless. Many gave in, returning to the drug simply to end the agony. Few had the strength or the support to endure it fully. For those who tried to resist, the risk was immense. Some died during withdrawal, their hearts giving out under the strain. Others suffered lasting damage, their nerves permanently shaken. The absence of medical understanding meant that families watched helplessly, unsure of what to do. The only relief seemed to come from the very substance that caused the suffering. To survive the fits, they had to drink again. In that paradox, the power of laudanum showed itself most clearly. I often feel that the saddest truth of this history is how people believe they were cursed with weakness, when in fact they were prisoners of a chemical trap no one had warned them about. Even in public places, signs of withdrawal appeared. Men at work dropped tools, trembling uncontrollably. Women fainted in markets, their skin drenched with sweat. Strangers helped them sit or lie down, assuming it was simple faintness. When the episode passed after another sip of laudanum, no one questioned the cause. The explanation was always fragility, delicate nerves, or exhaustion. The deeper truth remained invisible. The cycle hardened its grip over time. Each withdrawal fit convinced addicts that they could not live without the drug. They remembered the terror of those hours or days and vowed never to endure them again. Thus, they increased their daily doses, not for pleasure, but to avoid suffering. The memory of pain was enough to tie them forever to the bottle. Addiction did not require joy. It required fear, and laudanum provided both the escape and the punishment. The picture of bodies twisting in pain, sweating through sheets, and crying out for relief shows how withdrawal defined the private reality of laudanum addiction. These were not rare events, but common patterns repeated across countless homes. The fact that society explained such suffering away as weakness or nervous illness reveals how little they understood about what was truly happening. What becomes important next is how women, in particular, carried these torments quietly, expected to endure their fits without complaint, their silence becoming part of the hidden fabric of Georgian households. Once laudanum had been used long enough, the body no longer responded to the same small doses. In the beginning, a teaspoon was enough to calm nerves or stop pain. After days and weeks, the same amount felt weak. People believed their illnesses were worsening, so they swallowed more. They trusted the bottle without doubt. They did not see that the medicine itself had reshaped them. The drug no longer soothed. It commanded. The change from relief to dependence happened quietly. Someone who once mixed a few drops into tea began drinking it plain. Soon, a spoonful was not enough. Larger amounts became a daily habit. What once worked gently now required more and more. Families saw bottles empty faster, yet they explained it away as fragile health. It is almost amusing that people trusted laudanum more when it worked less, instead of asking why their bodies cried for greater amounts. Morning routines shifted first. People woke unsteady, shaking until they drank. Breakfast lost meaning. Instead of bread, they sipped laudanum. Workers carried flasks to jobs, pausing often. Women took it before grooming. Children given drops by mothers soon needed larger shares. The bottle became the center of every morning. By noon, another dose was taken. By night, more still. The rhythm of life became the rhythm of the drug. The body weakened under this cycle. Skin turned pale, lips cracked, eyes dulled. Weight dropped as appetite disappeared. Constipation became constant. Stomachs twisted with cramps. Women lost their cycles. Men lost the strength to labor. Families saw a decline but called it a weakness of nature. Doctors agreed, prescribing still more. If we compare it to our time, it is like a doctor telling a patient to increase narcotics every week while calling the side effects proof of bad blood instead of addiction. Memory faltered as doses climbed. Thoughts slowed. Sentences broke apart. Parents repeated themselves to children. Workers dropped tools. Housewives forgot tasks. Servants covering mistakes. Decline of the mind was explained as aging or nerves. Few admitted that laudanum itself was the cause. Silence covered the truth. People lived in decline and called it normal. Wealthy homes masked the habit with polish. Bottles stood in cabinets, measured with silver spoons. Doctors reassured families that patients were sensitive but stable. Poor homes showed the raw truth. People drank from chipped cups, grimaced at the taste, and slumped in corners. Children watched without words. Both rich and poor were ruled by the same drug. I feel that laudanum erased class more effectively than any law, binding people of all ranks under the same invisible chain. Fear drove the climb. People remembered the misery of withdrawal. They recalled sweats, cramps, shaking, and dread. To avoid it, they drank more quickly and more often. Addiction no longer gave pleasure. It held back torment. The prison was locked not by joy but by fear. People stayed in the cycle because leaving meant pain greater than they could bear. Apothecaries profited. Bottles sold faster and in larger sizes. Customers returned often, sometimes daily. Doctors gave notes to justify every purchase. Families praised laudanum for keeping loved ones alive. No one asked why doses rose so high. No one questioned why lives grew smaller while bottles grew larger. The trade thrived in silence. The climb had no ceiling. Some people drank so much that their hearts failed suddenly. Death was explained as frailty, old age, or illness. Empty bottles nearby told the true story. Laudanum had hollowed them until nothing was left. Yet even in death, the drug was praised as comfort. Society refused to name the prison that had claimed so many. Survivors lived in shadows. They did not seek joy. They sought to stand, to walk, to keep breath steady. Each swallow was not a choice but a demand. Families accepted it as normal. Children grew up learning that every meal, every night, every trip began and ended with laudanum. Life bent around the bottle until nothing outside it mattered. Neighbors noticed the fading health of entire households. In some streets, 2 or 3 families all lived under the same fog, with children running errands to fetch bottles as if it were bread or milk. The habit passed quietly from parent to child, teaching the next generation dependence before they could name it. The prison required no guards. It stood in plain sight. Bottles on shelves, spoons on tables, cups by bedsides. No bars were needed. The body enforced the sentence. Each larger dose was another lock. Each swallow proved escape impossible. People believed they were saving themselves. In truth, they were feeding the jailer who owned them. The city carried the evidence everywhere. markets filled with pale faces, workshops slowed under weak hands. Even churches saw their pews lined with men and women swaying under the weight of constant dosing. What was once a medicine for the sick had become the background rhythm of an entire society. The image of men and women taking ever larger amounts only to stay upright shows how the body had become a prisoner of laudanum. The search for comfort had turned into a battle for survival. The fact that laudanum was praised as a healer even while it forced endless doses makes its hold darker still. What comes next is the story of how even sleep, once seen as a refuge, was taken over by the same drug, turning nights into long, uneasy hours. Once laudanum had claimed the waking hours, it soon reached into the nights, where sleep was supposed to bring rest. For many who relied on it, nights no longer offered peace. The drug pushed them into long hours of drowsiness, but not into deep slumber. Their eyes closed, their bodies lay still, but their minds drifted in uneasy currents. They did not wake restored. They woke more tired, more heavy, more hollow. Sleep, once the final refuge of the weary, became another stage of captivity. At first, laudanum seemed to help with rest. People took it at night to ease pain and soften nerves. The first nights felt calm, but soon, the body adapted just as it had during the day. The doses increased. Instead of easing into gentle sleep, people collapsed into a stupor. Hours passed, but dreams turned uneasy. Thoughts confused. They awoke with heads pounding, mouths dry, stomachs twisted. It is almost darkly funny that the same drug sold as a sleep aid left its users waking more exhausted than when they went to bed. Morning after morning, people described heavy limbs, throbbing temples, and restless minds. Instead of renewal, nights delivered punishment. Families noticed relatives who spent 12 hours in bed but still shuffled through the day, weak and dazed. The pattern repeated in households across London. Some thought they were cursed with fragile health. Others believed poor air or damp houses caused the fatigue. Few admitted that laudanum had stolen rest itself. The pattern worsened with time. The more people drank, the more shallow their sleep became. Their bodies twitched, their breaths turned uneven. Some spoke nonsense in their dreams, others rose from beds, wandering halls without memory. Servants whispered about masters walking with blank eyes, moving objects, muttering words, then returning to bed as if nothing had happened. These moments of sleepwalking frightened households, but no one connected them directly to the drug. The wealthy endured these nights in silence. Fine bed sheets hid restless limbs. Servants were told not to speak of strange behavior. Doctors reassured families that nerves often disturbed sleep, that sensitivity explained the movements. Poor households endured more openly. Children woke to see parents wandering rooms or crying in half-sleep. Neighbors heard groans through thin walls. They all understood that something was wrong, but they lacked words to explain it. If we compare it to today, it would be like a patient taking heavy sleeping pills only to spend the night tossing, muttering, and rising confused, yet still being told by doctors that the medicine was safe. The mind did not rest. Dreams grew vivid, tangled, and disturbing. People spoke of seeing faces, hearing voices, or reliving memories. Some woke screaming, others woke crying without cause. By day, they felt dazed, unable to separate dreams from reality. Memory slipped further, and concentration weakened. Nights that should have healed only deepened confusion. Bodies carried the cost as well. Without deep sleep, muscles failed to recover. Hands trembled more each day. Eyes grew sunken. Backs bent under constant fatigue. People aged quickly, appearing older than their years. Children noticed their parents fading, but they thought it was a way of life. In truth, laudanum had stolen the healing power of sleep and replaced it with hollow hours of stupor. Some users tried to cut back at night, hoping to rest naturally. They found it impossible. Without laudanum, Sleep refused to come. They tossed for hours, drenched in sweat, cramping in pain. At last, in desperation, they drank again. Relief came, but only in the same shallow stupor as before. The prison left no exit. Sleep itself depended on the drug, yet the drug ruined sleep. The cycle repeated in every class. Merchants woke with headaches, mothers woke with swollen eyes. Children raised in homes with constant dosing learned that nights meant moaning, wandering, and unease. The city itself felt it. Streets filled each morning with men and women walking as if half asleep. Markets bustled with sluggish movement. Workshops echoed with yawns and dropped tools. Even churches filled with drowsy faces, heads nodding through sermons. Laudanum had invaded the very rhythm of rest. Doctors kept describing the problem as a weakness of the constitution. They offered no cure but more medicine. Priests said poor sleep was a trial to be endured. Families spoke of their relatives as delicate. No one admitted that the drug designed to heal had become the thief of rest. The silence gave laudanum more power. It remained respected, even as it drained people night after night. I cannot help but feel that watching entire households sink into restless nights, while still praising laudanum, shows how denial can blind a society to its suffering. The evidence lay in pale faces and heavy steps, yet people refused to see it. Over time, the lack of true rest changed character itself. People grew irritable, impatient, and withdrawn. Small arguments erupted in homes. Workplaces grew tense. Communities lost warmth as tired minds and bodies struggled to cope. The absence of deep sleep hollowed not only the body but the spirit. Lives shrank, narrowed to the cycle of dosing and waking without peace. The picture of men and women taking laudanum at night only to wake more tired each morning shows how even sleep had been turned into another prison. The fact that laudanum remained praised as medicine while it destroyed the very purpose of rest makes its hold even more cruel. What follows is how families themselves began to unravel under the constant weight of addiction, as love and duty collided with dependence in the most private corners of the home. The decline of a laudanum addict's body was a slow destruction that no one could mistake once it had begun. Faces that once carried colour and life became pale, grey, and sunken. The eyes were no longer steady. They retreated into hollows, surrounded by shadows that even the heavy powders and rouges of Georgian society could not hide. A person who once filled out their clothing properly began to look as if the garments belonged to someone else. The fabric sagged, the shape diminished, and the figure grew frail. This was not a weakness that could be disguised at a ball or in a drawing room. It was written across every feature of the addict's appearance, and those around them noticed, even when they avoided saying so aloud. The digestive system was often the first to fail. Constipation of a kind that lasted for days left sufferers curled in bed, trapped in discomfort. Some tried to escape the pain by consuming even more laudanum, creating a cycle that deepened the damage. Others suffered the opposite, violent, exhausting bouts of diarrhea that left them trembling and unable to move about with dignity. Both conditions brought shame and exhaustion. Meals became smaller, then skipped altogether. The presence of food on the table turned into a burden, with servants quietly carrying away untouched plates. It almost seems darkly amusing that a drug once praised as a soothing medicine could so quickly destroy the very appetite that kept people alive. The hands gave away the neck sign, nails cracked and split, often tearing painfully against cloth or paper. Fingers shook when holding a quill, spilling ink across the page. A raised glass trembled against the lips. Gloves became common among those who could afford them, but they covered little more than the broken nails, not the trembling beneath. Women suffered cruelly when their hair began to fall. Brushes filled with strands, and hairpieces became not just fashion but a necessity. Men, though often excused by age for thinning crowns, could not hide the lifeless tone of their skin or the dullness of their eyes. The body, once strong, betrayed its decline in ways that wigs and powders could never disguise. Strength left the body quickly. Rising from bed became a task that required determination. Walking across a room became exhausting. Once upright, legs shook and muscles gave way. Tasks that once filled the day, from running shops to writing letters or managing a household, fell away. The addict sat still for long hours, staring at the fire or out the window, unable to gather the energy to act. Time stretched without meaning, and entire days passed in silence. Women faced harsher judgment in this decline. Georgian society measured them by beauty, grace, and health. A pale face at a social gathering or a fainting spell during a carriage ride brought whispers. Families explained away their weakness as a natural delicacy, preferring to preserve appearances rather than confront the truth. It reminds me of how modern people also invent softer explanations for destructive habits, avoiding the truth in order to feel less uncomfortable. Men suffered too, but their humiliation appeared in the public sphere. Clerks lost their positions when their hands could not keep their writing steady. Merchants failed to balance their accounts. Labourers fell behind in their duties, unable to keep up with the pace of work. In taverns and clubs, men who once joined in laughter sat silently, their frail appearance marking them as outsiders. The family home showed the greatest burden of all. Children watched their parents fade before their eyes. A father too weak to lift his child, or a mother too exhausted to rise from bed, left scars that no polite excuse could cover. Servants bore witness as well. They carried basins, cleaned up after sickness, and watched their employers collapse into weakness. Silence surrounded these duties, for few dared to speak openly of what they saw. Portraits of the time tried to hide this truth. Painters softened the features of their subjects, adding colour to cheeks and fullness to faces. But behind closed doors, candlelight revealed what no portrait could disguise. A gaunt figure sat hunched in a chair, bones sharp beneath thin skin, hair dull, nails broken, hands twitching. In finely furnished homes, surrounded by polished wood and heavy drapery, addict seemed out of place, fragile shadows in grand rooms. This collapse was not limited to the wealthy. In crowded working homes and damp tenements, the same signs appeared. The addict wasted away, unable to labour, unable to provide. The loss of wages brought hunger, and hunger hastened the decline. Laudanum did not distinguish between classes. It ruined the strong and the fragile alike, reducing both to weakness. Doctors often failed to see the truth. They prescribed more laudanum to treat the very symptoms it had caused. Families followed their advice, clinging to the hope that medicine would heal. In reality, each new dose pushed the addict deeper into collapse. They saw their bodies break piece by piece, hollowed eyes, brittle nails, thinning hair, shaking hands, and exhausted muscles. I cannot help but think how frightening it must have been to look into a mirror and recognize that the medicine you relied upon was the same force undoing your body. The decay of the body was relentless. It did not pause for wealth, reputation, or hope. It marked itself in the way a person walked, the way they looked, the way they failed to eat, and the way they sat in silence. Society continued to call it weakness or delicate health, avoiding the word addiction. But the evidence was there, in every trembling hand and every grey face. And if the wasting of the body could already be read in hollow cheeks and trembling hands, the very smell that clung to the addict would betray their suffering even more clearly. Among all the signs that marked a laudanum addict in Georgian London, none was more inescapable than the smell that followed them. It was not the scent of perfume or the aroma of food clinging to their clothing. It was something more unsettling, a mixture of alcohol, bitterness, and decay that no washing could erase. Laudanum was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, and its odour did not disappear once swallowed. It seeped through the breath, through the pores of the skin, and into the very air around the addict. Families noticed it in shared rooms. Servants smelled it when they dressed their employers. Strangers caught it in the street. It was a constant presence, a reminder that addiction was never truly hidden. The breath of the addict carried the strongest clue. It was heavy with the sourness of alcohol and the bitterness of medicine. Conversations were difficult because the odor pushed people back, even when politeness demanded that they stand close. Husbands avoided their wives. Wives turned their faces from their husbands, and friends found excuses not to linger. It feels almost cruelly comic that the same society that drenched itself in powders, scented oils, and flowers had to endure conversations perfumed by the reek of a drug. No amount of cloves, mint leaves, or scented handkerchiefs could disguise it for long. It returned again and again, as permanent as the addiction itself. The skin of the addict betrayed another layer of this distinctive smell. Pallor was already obvious to the eye, but touch and closeness revealed clamminess. The skin was often cold and damp, a sheen of sweat forming even in cool weather. The odor of this sweat was different from that of ordinary exertion. It carried the sharp note of medicine and the sour trace of sickness. In crowded rooms, where Georgian society gathered for dinners or musical evenings, the addict stood apart even when dressed in fine clothing. Perfumed oils and powdered wigs could not mask the truth that the body itself was leaking the drug. Hands told their own story. They shook with weakness, but they also gave off the scent of dryness and neglect. Lips cracked and bled, leaving traces on cups and linens. The mouth itself was often dry, leaving addicts constantly licking their lips or sipping water in vain attempts at relief. This dryness produced its odor, a faintly sour note that blended with the bitter alcohol of laudanum. It reminds me of how in modern times we sometimes recognize illness not by appearance but by scent, whether from medicine, alcohol, or neglect of hygiene. The recognition comes instantly, even when no one dares to name it aloud. Those who lived closest to addicts were most familiar with these details. Wives noticed the smell when sharing a bed with their husbands. Children smelled it when kissed on the forehead or held in weak arms. Servants noticed it when they dressed their employers in the morning or brushed their hair. Even doctors, who prescribed the drug, must have known it when they bent close to examine their patients. The odor of laudanum was everywhere, and yet it was rarely spoken of directly. Families preferred to call it weakness or fatigue rather than face the truth. The presence of this smell carried social consequences. Georgian society prized appearances and cleanliness. To be marked by an unpleasant odor was humiliating. At gatherings, whispers spread quickly. Guests exchanged glances when an addict entered the room. Some excused themselves early, unwilling to sit near the source. Others chose to tolerate it, but they never forgot. Reputation in this society was fragile, and the addict's scent destroyed it as surely as trembling hands or hollow cheeks. The addicts themselves often became aware of this reality. They tried to mask it with scented waters or stronger perfumes, but the effect was temporary. Oils of lavender, rose water, or even vinegar were used in vain. No matter what remedies they attempted, the laudanum smell broke through. Some gave up altogether, retreating from social life to avoid embarrassment. Their withdrawal was not only due to weakness of body, but also to the shame of being recognized by scent alone. Working people endured even harsher consequences. In workshops or markets, the smell of laudanum set them apart. Customers avoided their stalls, colleagues muttered behind their backs, and employers suspected unreliability. In crowded tenements, where families lived side by side, the odor spread from room to room. Quarrels broke out when neighbors accused each other of filth or drunkenness. The addict became an outcast even among those who lived with poverty and hardship. What makes this detail haunting is its permanence. The smell was not just an occasional symptom. It was constant surrounding the addict at all times, a halo of decline that followed them wherever they went. It revealed addiction even when other signs could still be disguised. Before the trembling hands, before the hollow cheeks, before the weakness made work impossible. The smell betrayed them. I cannot help but think that this must have been one of the most isolating parts of the decline, to know that even standing silently in a room, the body itself announced the addiction to everyone present. The distinctive smell of laudanum was not recorded in elegant diaries or polite letters. It was not painted into portraits or described in medical text with precision. Yet it was there, noted in whispers, in the avoidance of company, in the way servants wrinkle their noses or children pulled back. History records the more visible signs: thinness, weakness, trembling. But the smell was just as real and just as devastating. In the end, the addict's body was not only collapsing but also betraying itself in every possible way. Appearance, strength, and even scent turned against them. Georgian London prided itself on refinement, but within its polished homes and crowded streets, the smell of laudanum marked a hidden plague. It was a constant reminder that the drug was not just inside the body but leaking outward, staining every interaction, every moment of intimacy, and every attempt at normal life. The smell clung to them in bed, at the table, in the street, in the church, in the marketplace. It was inescapable, and for those who lived near an addict, it became impossible to forget. The decay of the body had already been visible. Now the air itself betrayed the addict, and beyond the skin and breath, the next stage of decline would unfold in the mind, where visions and hallucinations blurred the line between dream and reality. The body of the addict had already shown its collapse, but the mind carried its horrors. Laudanum was not only a poison to the stomach and the skin, it was also a poison to perception itself. Many addicts lived in a state where dreams and reality blended so closely that they could no longer separate one from the other. What began as mild distortions, vivid dreams, or unusual sensations, soon became constant companions. For some, hallucinations became as common as breathing, a private world imposed upon the real one. Families and servants often could not tell whether the addict was awake or asleep, because their words and expressions belonged to a realm outside the ordinary. The visions themselves varied. Some addicts described seeing shapes or people that were not present. A chair in the corner appeared to hold a seated figure, or a shadow across the wall seemed to move of its own accord. The flicker of candlelight became a face. The rustling of fabric was mistaken for whispers. These illusions haunted every room of a Georgian house, from parlours to bedchambers. It seems almost ridiculous that people believed laudanum brought calm when, in reality, it often filled rooms with imaginary guests. Voices were another torment. Addicts heard people calling their names when no one was near. Sometimes they reported long conversations, as if unseen companions were speaking directly into their ears. These voices could be soft, almost comforting, or loud and commanding. They told the addict what to do, or reminded them of fears they already carried. At night, when houses grew quiet, the voices became more persistent. Families lying in nearby rooms listened uneasily as the addict spoke into the silence, answering people who were not there. Touch became unreliable as well. Many addicts swore that hands brushed against them, or that someone sat beside them when no one had entered the room. Some felt pressure on their chest, as if they were being held down. Others complained of insects crawling over their skin, leading them to scratch until they bled. Servants who entered their rooms found them clawing at their arms or shaking off blankets as though to rid themselves of creatures. What was invisible to others was undeniable to the addict. The line between dreams and waking blurred quickly. Laudanum induced long hours of restless sleep, filled with visions so vivid that the addict often woke uncertain of whether they had truly happened. They carried the emotions of those dreams into waking life. If they dreamed of betrayal, they accused family members. If they dreamed of death, they mourned as though someone close to them had truly died. Each day became a continuation of the night before. It reminds me of how modern people sometimes struggle after vivid nightmares, carrying fear into the morning, except here the nightmare never stopped when the eyes opened. Families struggled to manage this new stage of decline. A wife might listen to her husband describe strangers walking through their house. A mother might comfort a child who insisted a figure stood at the window. Servants were asked to chase away intruders who did not exist. These hallucinations created constant tension, as every member of the household was drawn into the addict's imagined world. Neighbors heard the shouting, the cries, the strange conversations, and they, too, began to whisper. The addict's fear grew heavier with each passing day. Some begged not to be left alone because they were certain someone would harm them. Others shut themselves away, convinced that invisible watchers followed them. Ordinary shadows became threatening. The creak of the floorboards became footsteps. The city itself seemed alive with danger, even in the quiet of their rooms. I cannot help but think how exhausting it must have been to live in a state where every sound and every shadow became a source of terror. Social life, already strained by the visible decay of the body, collapsed completely under the weight of hallucinations. Guests no longer visited, friends withdrew. Even close relatives began to avoid prolonged contact, embarrassed or frightened by what they witnessed. Some families tried to hide the truth, insisting that their loved ones suffered from nerves or fever. But secrecy was hard to maintain. Too many servants had seen too much. For the addict, hallucinations became ordinary. Days and nights were filled with visions, and soon they stopped questioning them. The imagined world carried as much weight as the real one. They might argue with invisible figures, hide from shadows, or wander in confusion. Work became impossible. Conversation with others turned strange, full of references to things no one else could see or hear. Eventually, reality itself seemed less convincing than the hallucinations. Doctors, far from offering clarity, often worsened the problem. Believing the patient restless or agitated, they prescribed even more laudanum. More doses only deepened the illusions. Medical texts of the time sometimes describe visions as unfortunate side effects, but few recognized them as a symptom of addiction. Families, trusting in physicians, followed their advice, and the cycle continued. The more the addict suffered, the more laudanum was given, and the more the hallucinations consumed their world. In Georgian society, where reputation was carefully guarded, these visions became a source of shame. Families avoided speaking of them in public. Some even confined addicts to private rooms, hoping to keep the behavior hidden. But in houses with thin walls and watchful neighbors, secrecy was rarely possible. The sounds of shouting, the cries of fear, and the murmurs to invisible companions gave everything away. What had begun as a private struggle became a public disgrace. In some cases, hallucinations led to dangerous outcomes. Addicts acted on what they saw or heard, lashing out at those around them or wandering into the streets in confusion. A figure imagined as an intruder might provoke violence. A voice demanding action might drive someone into reckless behavior. Families locked doors not just to protect the addict from themselves, but to protect others as well. Laudanum, once considered a harmless comfort, turned homes into places of unpredictability and fear. As days passed, the addict lost the ability to trust their senses. They questioned nothing, accepted everything, and surrendered to the visions. Reality slipped further away, and the family watched helplessly as their loved one disappeared into a world that no one else could see. This was not a momentary illness. It was a permanent state. The visions did not leave once the drug wore off. They remained, waiting in the shadows, ready to emerge again at the next dose. The destruction of the body had already been a visible tragedy, but the destruction of the mind created a prison even more complete. The addict lived trapped in illusions, their every thought colored by shadows, whispers, and imagined touches. Georgian society had little understanding of what was happening. They called it weakness, melancholy, or madness. In truth, it was laudanum writing itself into every corner of the addict's perception. Hallucinations were not rare outbursts. They were the daily life of the addict, a constant distortion of the world around them. Families who once hoped their loved one might recover from physical weakness now saw them lost entirely to unreality. What made it worse was that writers and poets began to turn these visions into something fashionable, giving people reasons to try the very drug that ruined so many lives. By the beginning of the 19th century, laudanum was no longer just a household medicine or a secret indulgence. It had become part of the cultural imagination. Writers and poets, the very people who shaped how society thought and dreamed, began to present laudanum not as a poison but as a doorway. They described it as a path into other worlds, a substance that lifted the mind above ordinary life and allowed it to touch something greater. To read their works was to believe that laudanum was not a curse but a blessing, and that its effects were a kind of inspiration rather than a form of decline. One of the most famous examples was the poet Thomas de Quincey, who wrote openly about his experiences in Confessions of an English Opium Eater. In his pages, he spoke not only of the suffering but also of the extraordinary visions he encountered. The detail with which he described them gave readers the sense that laudanum was a magical key, opening doors to images and emotions that ordinary life could never provide. It is little ironic that people who could barely afford bread were being told that salvation might be found in a bottle of bitter medicine. His words reached far beyond his circle, influencing young writers who saw in his confessions something daring and almost heroic. Other poets of the Romantic movement also touched upon the idea of laudanum as a creative spark. Some hinted at its use quietly, while others were more direct. They described heightened dreams, expanded thoughts, and feelings of weightlessness. To a reader, it sounded as though the drug was not destroying lives but rather enriching them. The truth that it left bodies hollow and minds fragile was lost in the beauty of the lines. The Romantic era was already filled with fascination for extremes of emotion, with storms, ruins, and ghosts. Laudanum slipped naturally into this world, taking on the same sense of mystery and power. The problem was not just what these writers experienced, but how their readers received it. Young people, especially those who admired the Romantic poets, saw laudanum as a way to live closer to genius. They did not want to be weak or ruined, but they wanted to feel what their idols described. They wanted to touch the visions, the soaring thoughts, the strange intensity of being that came with the drug. And so, bottles that once sat quietly on apothecary shelves now carried the glow of cultural approval. They were no longer medicine. They were part of a lifestyle, almost a ritual for those who sought meaning beyond the ordinary. The tragic irony was that the very writers who made laudanum sound so alluring also suffered deeply from its effects. Their health collapsed, their friendships frayed, and their days filled with the same misery as any other addict. Yet readers often ignored these parts, choosing instead to hold on to the glowing descriptions of visions and inspiration. The confession of misery was read, but the memory of beauty remained stronger. This selective reading allowed the cycle to continue as each new admirer turned to the drug, believing they would be different. Georgian and early Victorian society was already fascinated by the idea of altered states. Spiritualism, dreams, and supernatural stories filled the imagination. Laudanum fit easily into this world, lending credibility to tales of visions and strange encounters. Some writers even claim that the drug allowed them to cross into the realm of the dead, to see what others could not. These claims, whether sincere or exaggerated, gave laudanum a power that no physician could match. To a generation raised on poetry and story, the drug seemed almost holy. The spread of these ideas reached far. Middle-class readers who could afford books also had easy access to apothecaries. They could buy laudanum as easily as they bought tea. A book described the visions, a shop provided the bottle. And so, the circle continued. Those who admired art wanted to taste what created it. They took a spoonful, or a drop, or a glass, believing they were stepping into the same realm as the poets they adored. It reminds me of how in the modern world, young people sometimes imitate celebrities who glamorize destructive habits. forgetting that the cost is rarely shown as clearly as the fantasy. Not all writers joined in this romanticization. Some, like Coleridge, wrote of their struggles with laudanum in terms of despair as well as inspiration. But even in their accounts, readers often found what they wanted to find. They ignored the pain and clung to the promise of beauty. They believed they could experience the visions without enduring the suffering. This hope was misplaced, but it was powerful. Literature gave them permission to try, and society offered no warning strong enough to counter it. For families already suffering, the influence of literature was a cruel twist. A father weakened by laudanum might be excused by his children as a dreamer rather than a patient. A mother who withdrew into visions might be pitied rather than helped. Books made addiction sound less like decline and more like eccentricity. Instead of shame, some felt pride, believing they shared in the same struggles as famous poets. What was truly destruction was disguised as brilliance. I think this shows how dangerous words can be when they polish a reality that should have been left raw and unappealing. The culture of romanticism valued the extreme, and laudanum provided it. Writers offered images of towering dreams, strange terrors, and profound joys. Readers embraced them, hungry for intensity. But in quiet homes across London, the reality remained unchanged. Bodies collapsed, families fractured, and lives ended early. No amount of poetic description could make that less true. The beauty of words was powerful, but it could not hide the bitter smell, the trembling hands, or the empty stomachs. As the 19th century advanced, laudanum's place in literature did not disappear. It became a motif, a sign of depth or sensitivity, a mark of someone who had seen beyond the surface. In truth, it was only a sign of someone caught in a net they could not escape. Yet the myth endured. Readers continued to believe, and some continued to try. The cultural halo remained long after the reality should have been undeniable. The romanticization of laudanum was not a harmless artistic flourish. It spread addiction, gave excuses, and silenced warnings. It gave the drug a reputation it never deserved, and in doing so, it ensured that more people would fall into its grasp. Writers and poets thought they were recording their own experiences, but their words became advertisements stronger than any apothecary sign. They wrote of visions, and their readers wanted to see. They wrote of dreams, and their readers wanted to dream. They wrote of inspiration, and their readers wanted to be inspired. The cycle was complete. The addict's body had collapsed. The addict's mind was lost in visions, and now even society's culture had turned the drug into something admired. But while literature glorified, families continued to suffer in silence, and the private tragedies piled higher behind closed doors. And soon, those tragedies would no longer remain private, as laudanum reached deeper into households and began to tear families apart. Addiction to laudanum in Georgian London not only destroyed individuals, it reached into the walls of houses, into marriages, into nurseries, and into every ordinary act of family life. The drug, praised as medicine and used without question, left families broken in ways that were rarely spoken of in public. The decline of one person was never contained to that person alone. It spread outward, silently dismantling households until nothing familiar remained. The husband was often the first to show the damage in a way that affected everyone around him. A man who once worked with steady hands in a shop, or kept accounts in a tidy office, or oversaw labor with confidence, now spent his days in a haze. The early hours that had once been spent preparing for business or labor were lost to the heavy pull of laudanum. He sat slumped in a chair, unable to concentrate, unable to remember tasks, unable to act. Work was missed, mistakes piled up, and employment disappeared. With work went income, and with income went security. Families who had relied on the strength of the father's labor found themselves staring at unpaid bills, empty cupboards, and landlords demanding rent. It almost seems absurd that society calls this a weakness of constitution, rather than recognizing it as the predictable ruin of addiction. The mother's role in these tragedies was no less harrowing. Laudanum was prescribed freely to women for pain, nerves, and sleeplessness. When those women became mothers, they often continued their use. A mother who nursed her infant passed the drug through her milk, and the child became dependent before it even learned to speak. Some infants grew quiet, subdued not by comfort but by the sedation of opium. Others wasted away, their small bodies unable to bear the substance. Families buried children without ever naming laudanum as the cause, writing fevers or weakness on the death records instead. Even when the child survived, their bond to the drug began from the earliest months. Mothers did not intend to harm. They were following the advice of doctors and the habits of their peers. Yet the damage was deep, passed from body to body in silence. A home that should have been filled with the cries and laughter of children was instead filled with a heavy stillness. It reminds me of modern times, when substances like alcohol or prescription pills sometimes seep into family life, shaping children's futures long before they have any choice. Children who grew older in these households carried other scars. They watched as their parents moved through life half asleep. They learned to expect that mornings would begin not with work but with confusion. They saw meals uneaten, tasks forgotten, tempers frayed. They became caregivers when they should have been cared for, fetching water, cleaning up messes, and enduring the sight of their parents lying listless on couches or beds. The memory of such a childhood could not be erased, and many carried it into their own adult lives. The silence surrounding these households made the suffering worse. Neighbors whispered but rarely intervened. Families excused the decline as delicate health, nervous strain, or exhaustion. Few admitted aloud that addiction had taken over. The shame of naming the truth was greater than the comfort of honesty. And so the suffering continued behind closed doors, each family isolated in its decline. I think this silence is one of the most chilling parts of laudanum's history, because it allowed so many homes to fall apart without a single outcry. Marriages are strained to the breaking point. Husbands who could no longer provide were scorned. Wives who lost their beauty and strength became objects of pity rather than partners. Intimacy faded, replaced by resentment and silence. In some homes, violence erupted as addicts lashed out under the weight of their illness. In others, withdrawal replaced conflict, and couples lived as strangers under the same roof. The vows they had made to each other, promises of partnership, comfort, and shared burdens, were undone by the presence of a liquid in a bottle. Extended families sometimes stepped in, but their help was often limited. Grandparents took in children. Aunts and uncles offered food or shelter. Yet the shame of addiction kept many from seeking or accepting aid. Pride held them back even as the home collapsed. In the end, the destruction was almost always borne by the smallest and weakest members of the family. Children paid the highest price, losing not only security but also the stability of love and care. The appearance of such households in Georgian society was common enough to be noticed, yet rarely named. In wealthier homes, servants whispered about their employers and gossiped in kitchens about the strange behavior they witnessed upstairs. In poorer homes, neighbors talked in the streets about children left unattended or women too weak to rise from bed. Everyone knew, yet no one said the word addiction. It was a social disaster carried out in silence. The cultural romanticization of laudanum by poets and writers only made things worse. Families who might have sought help instead clung to the idea that their struggles were marks of sensitivity or depth. A husband lost in dreams was excused as imaginative. A wife too weak to manage her children was pitied as delicate. Children growing up in chaos were told their parents were simply unwell, not that they were enslaved to a drug. The language of excuse covered the reality of collapse. The destruction of families was not dramatic in the sense of a single event. It was slow, like the steady unraveling of a thread. Day after day, The effects of laudanum stripped away the roles and bonds that made a family whole. Fathers lost jobs, mothers passed weakness to children, and children grew up in confusion. By the time outsiders realized the full extent of the damage, it was often too late. The home had already disintegrated into fragments. Some families endured this decline for years, clinging to the hope that the addict might recover, that work might return, that health might improve, but without recognition of the real cause, there was no path to change. Laudanum remained in the cupboards, in the bedside tables, in the nurseries. The bottle that had begun as medicine remained the silent master of the home. The story of laudanum's destruction cannot be told only through individual suffering. It must also be told through the collapse of families, through the way households once full of life became quiet with despair. This was the hidden history of Georgian London, a city where polite society looked away while homes were broken apart one by one. The addict's body had decayed, their mind had wandered into visions, and now the family itself lay in ruins. But the destruction did not stop at the household door. It spread outward, aided by the very places that should have offered protection, the apothecaries and physicians who sold and prescribed laudanum without limit. And that is where the next part of this story begins, with the role of pharmacies and the easy purchase of a drug that destroyed so many lives. The silent destruction of families could never have spread so far without the cooperation of the places where laudanum was sold. In Georgian London, pharmacies and apothecaries were not guardians against abuse, but suppliers who placed the drug into eager hands without question. Laudanum was not treated as a dangerous substance. It was sold as casually as tea or sugar, packaged neatly and displayed with pride. The rules that might have limited its use did not exist. The result was that anyone, from a wealthy gentleman to a working mother, could walk into a shop and leave with enough of the drug to ruin themselves and their families. There were no restrictions on dosage. Bottles carried no warning labels, no instructions about safe limits, no cautions about dependence. The only guidance came from the apothecary's lips, and that guidance was often careless. Some told customers simply to take more if the pain or the sleeplessness continued. If it does not help, increase the dose, was the common advice. And so, people did. They drank more and more, never suspecting that the drug itself was creating the very symptoms they were trying to ease. It almost feels laughable that the same society that prized order and rules in everything from manners to clothing allowed a drug this powerful to be sold without a single rule. The way laudanum was presented made it even more dangerous. Bottles were often beautifully made, with polished glass and ornate labels. Some were decorated with flourishes of lettering that made them resemble fine wines or tonics. They looked like something beneficial, even luxurious, to place on a shelf or a bedside table. In homes that valued appearances, a bottle of laudanum did not look like a shameful object. It looked like part of the refinement. Families left them in plain sight, unashamed, because the packaging disguised the truth. Apothecaries themselves profited heavily. Laudanum was cheap to make and easy to sell. Demand was steady and growing, and few questioned the morality of selling more. For them, it was business. Each bottle sold meant money in the till. Customers came back again and again, not only because they believed it worked, but because they had already grown dependent. Apothecaries saw the same faces daily, buying larger amounts, but they did not refuse them. On the contrary, they encouraged repeat visits, often suggesting that customers keep extra bottles at home just in case. Doctors were no better. Many wrote prescriptions freely, even for minor complaints, sleeplessness, nervousness, grief, or a stomachache were all reasons to prescribe laudanum. In reality, no prescription was required. Anyone could buy it over the counter. The doctor's role was less about restriction and more about giving an air of authority, assuring families that their use was proper. The medical profession became part of the cycle, providing legitimacy to what was essentially unchecked addiction. The effect on households was devastating. Bottles multiplied in cabinets, on mantels, and in drawers. Children saw them as part of daily life. Servants fetched them without hesitation. Visitors noticed them and did not think twice. The ease of access meant that no addict was ever forced to confront their dependence directly. If one bottle ran low, another could be purchased within minutes. There was never a barrier to force reflection, never a pause that might have led to change. In poorer neighborhoods, laudanum was sold in smaller doses that even the working class could afford. A laborer could spend a small portion of his wages and receive enough to last a few days. Mothers bought it for infants, soothing cries that were really signs of hunger or illness. The bottles passed from hand to hand, cheap and common, their bitterness hidden in sugar or tea. In richer homes, larger and more elegant bottles sat among silverware and porcelain. Different classes, same substance, same destruction. Society's indifference allowed this trade to thrive. Newspapers carried advertisements for laudanum, describing it as a cure for everything from headaches to broken hearts. No mention was made of dependence, of collapse, of death. The drug was sold as universal comfort, a solution to every problem, a friend in every sorrow. Those who read these lines believed them, because there was nothing else to challenge them. The silence of regulation left only the voices of sellers and advertisers, and those voices spoke of profit. It is striking how far the deception went. Bottles looked respectable, labels sounded reassuring, and advice from apothecaries encouraged overuse. It reminds me of how modern industries sometimes package harmful products with glossy images and soothing words, making danger appear safe. The pattern is not new, it is only repeated. Those who became addicted rarely blamed the apothecaries or doctors. They blamed themselves, or they accepted the decline as an illness. This, too, served the sellers well. If the addict did not accuse, the trade continued without resistance. The very people who needed protection were left unprotected, convinced that they alone were at fault. Over time, some voices did begin to question the practice, but they were faint and often ignored. The scale of addiction was too large, and the profits too great. Apothecaries had no interest in closing their tills, and society had no structures to hold them accountable. The government remained silent, more concerned with maintaining order in the streets than in regulating what was sold in shops. And so laudanum continued to flow, bottle after bottle, into every level of society. In this way, pharmacies and apothecaries did not merely supply laudanum. They fueled the crisis, turned it into a business, and clothed it in respectability. Without their role, addiction might have remained smaller, contained to fewer lives. Instead, it spread everywhere, reaching from the poorest homes to the richest estates. The addict's collapse was not only personal or familial, it was supported by the very structures that should have provided care. And this support did not end with the apothecaries. Doctors themselves encouraged the habit, prescribing laudanum without hesitation and refusing to accept responsibility when it destroyed lives. That part of the story reveals how professional authority became a mask for ruin, and it is there that the history of laudanum grows even darker. By the time laudanum had become a fixture in Georgian households, the responsibility for guiding its use should have rested with the medical profession. Patients trusted their physicians. Families followed instructions carefully, believing that the doctor's word carried authority. Yet in the case of laudanum, that authority only deepened the problem. Instead of caution, there was encouragement. Instead of warnings, there was silence. Doctors, whether from ignorance, carelessness, or profit, prescribed laudanum freely and in large quantities. The very people who should have recognized the danger became part of the machine that spread it. Some physicians believed sincerely that laudanum could be used long-term to calm the mind and body. They'd seen its effect in the short term. It dulled pain, stilled nerves, and brought sleep. To them, these results looked like stability. They told patients that regular doses would protect them from agitation, anxiety, and sleeplessness. No mention was made of dependence, because most doctors did not recognize it as such. Instead, they called it a habit, weakness, or constitution. In their view, laudanum was a steady friend that would keep the patient balanced. Families clung to this advice, repeating the instructions without hesitation. It almost feels like a cruel joke that the very profession trusted to preserve health gave instructions that ensured decline. Prescriptions were often written without limits. A patient could be told to take laudanum daily, indefinitely. Some doctors advised increasing the dose if symptoms persisted. Few ever suggested lowering it. And because laudanum could also be purchased directly from apothecaries without a prescription, the physician's note became more of a blessing than a necessity. It gave legitimacy to what people were already doing. A written slip carried the weight of approval. To the patient, it was proof that their use was not only acceptable but recommended. The culture of medicine at the time made this worse. Physicians were often eager to present themselves as learned men who could ease any suffering. Pain, grief, and nervous conditions were common complaints. People wanted relief, and laudanum was the easiest tool at hand. Prescribing it was quick, effective in the moment, and appreciated by patients. It reinforced the doctor's reputation as a healer. Long-term consequences were not part of the calculation. The focus was on immediate results, not on what the drug would do after months or years of use. For women especially, laudanum became the universal cure. Doctors prescribed it for menstrual pain, for melancholy, for sleeplessness, for anxiety, even for grief after losing a child. These were not short courses of treatment. Many women were instructed to continue indefinitely, to take laudanum as part of daily life. Bottles lined their dressing tables, as normal as powders and perfumes. Families accepted this as medical advice, not realizing that dependence was forming. The result was that entire households were drawn into the cycle, with mothers, daughters, and even infants exposed to the drug. When signs of addiction appeared, tremors, pallor, weakness, confusion, doctors rarely acknowledged that laudanum was the cause. They often prescribed more. If a patient reported pain, more laudanum was recommended. If they described sleeplessness, another dose was suggested. If they showed anxiety, the doctor concluded that they required larger amounts to stabilize their nerves. The drug created the symptoms, and the symptoms created the justification for more of the drug. It reminds me of how, in modern times, some medications are still prescribed for years without recognition of the harm they cause, until the pattern becomes too obvious to ignore. Patients who realized something was wrong rarely found support. If they tried to stop taking laudanum and experienced withdrawal symptoms, doctors called it an illness. They blamed the patient's body, not the medicine. When families suspected that laudanum was making things worse, their concerns were brushed aside. The authority of the doctor outweighed their observations. Many households accepted the decline of their loved ones as unavoidable, never questioning the bottles lined up in the cupboard, because they carried the doctor's blessing. There were cases where patients became so visibly dependent that denial was impossible. Some begged for help, admitting that they could not stop drinking laudanum without terrible suffering. But even then, most doctors offered little. They had no method for withdrawal, no plan for treatment. Some advised confinement, locking the patient away to endure the worst of the withdrawal alone. Others withdrew their involvement entirely, telling families that nothing more could be done. Responsibility was avoided. Silence replaced action. I find it chilling that the very men who prescribed laudanum freely then stepped back and left their patients to collapse alone. The failure of doctors was not only medical, but also cultural. Their approval gave laudanum respectability. When a doctor recommended it, families treated its use as honorable, not shameful. This legitimization spread the drug deeper into society than apothecaries alone could have managed. Physicians were not only healers but also symbols of authority. If they said laudanum was safe, people believed it. This belief allowed addiction to grow unchecked across all classes, from wealthy families in townhouses to laborers in cramped lodgings. Some physicians did eventually begin to question the drug, but their voices were drowned out by the majority who continued to prescribe. There was no coordinated effort to warn the public, no official stance that laudanum was dangerous. It remained a personal decision, left to the discretion of each doctor, and most chose the easy path. They prescribed what was convenient, what was demanded, what kept patients satisfied in the moment. This lack of warning allowed addiction to thrive in silence. Families suffered, individuals collapsed, and yet no strong voice spoke out. There was no pamphlet, no lecture, no regulation. The medical profession, which might have slowed the spread, instead accelerated it. Laudanum became not just a household medicine but a trusted companion, encouraged by the very men who should have been its critics. In hindsight, it is easy to see how damaging this was. But for those living in Georgian London, surrounded by authority figures who spoke of laudanum as a steady aid, there was little chance of resisting. To reject the doctor's advice was to risk appearing foolish or ungrateful. People trusted, and in trusting, they fell deeper into dependence. The story of laudanum's rise cannot be told without acknowledging this failure. Doctors gave their blessing to a poison, and in doing so, they multiplied its reach. Their silence and their encouragement allowed the addiction to spread unchecked, leaving countless patients without guidance, families without protection, and society without awareness of what was happening. The apothecaries had profited by selling laudanum freely, but the physicians had given it authority. Together, they formed a system that placed bottles in every home and left no warnings behind. And when the inevitable collapse of patients came, the response was silence, denial, or abandonment. The addict's body had been betrayed by the medicine. The addict's mind had been filled with visions, and families had already suffered ruin. Now, even the trusted voices of doctors had become part of the destruction. And soon, the story would grow darker still, as addicts discovered that once the drug had taken hold, there was no simple way out. By the time laudanum had taken hold of a person's life, there was no easy escape. For some, there was no escape at all. Unlike habits that could be broken with determination, or illnesses that could heal with time, laudanum created a dependency so strong that stopping suddenly could kill. Families learned this truth in the harshest way possible, through experience. An addict who tried to abandon the bottle was thrown into violent sickness, their body convulsing with pain, their mind filled with terror. Some died in the attempt, proving to others that the only way forward was not to stop, but to keep drinking. This was the cruelest trap of all. To continue meant to decline slowly, wasting away piece by piece. To stop meant unbearable suffering, and often death. There were no clinics, no doctors trained to help, no therapies or safe methods. The idea of rehabilitation had not yet entered medical thought. Addiction itself was not recognized as a disease. Families had no guidance, only fear. They looked at their loved ones and saw the choice between two forms of destruction. Withdrawal came in waves of agony. The stomach cramped until a person writhed on the floor. Sweat poured from their skin, soaking sheets and clothing. Hands shook uncontrollably, teeth chattered, and fever gripped the body. Hallucinations intensified, with shadows and voices crowding the room. Many cried out, begging for relief, clawing at their flesh in desperation. Families watched in horror, powerless to help. It is almost grimly absurd that the same doctors who prescribed laudanum so freely had no answer at all for the suffering it caused when patients tried to stop. The knowledge spread through households and communities. Stories of people who tried to give up laudanum and died reinforced the belief that it was impossible. Neighbors whispered about men locked in bedrooms, thrashing and moaning until they grew still. Servants spoke of mistresses who wasted away when their supply was cut off. Everyone knew someone who had tried and failed. The lesson was clear: it was safer to continue drinking than to risk withdrawal. Because of this, addicts rarely made serious attempts to quit. Most resigned themselves to the bottle. They measured out doses, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but always regular. The drug became the center of their days, the only certainty left. Families enabled this, not because they approved, but because they feared the alternative. If the choice was between slow decay and violent collapse, they chose the slower path. Laudanum remained in the cupboards, in the drawers, on the bedside tables. It was never thrown away. The lack of support made everything worse. No institution existed to help. There were no asylums designed for addiction, no societies formed for recovery, no knowledge of safe reduction. To stop meant to fight alone, and few had the strength to endure it. It reminds me of how in our own time, even with all our knowledge, people still struggle to find help for dependency. In Georgian London, there was not even a word for what they faced. Families did what they could. They prayed, they pleaded, they tried to distract or restrain. But nothing changed the reality that only more laudanum would end the torment. Some households attempted the cruelest form of remedy, confinement. When an addict's behavior grew unbearable, relatives sometimes locked them in a room, removed the bottles, and left them to suffer. They provided water, sometimes food, but nothing else. The cries could last for days, echoing through hallways. Servants shivered at the sound. Children wept, listening to the moans of parents behind closed doors. Sometimes the screams ended in silence because the addict survived long enough to return to the drug. Other times, the silence meant death. Families rarely spoke of these deaths, recording them as weakness, fever, or exhaustion. This confinement did not bring recovery, it brought terror. Those who survived often emerged more determined never to be without laudanum again. The memory of withdrawal was too strong, the pain too vivid. They clung to their bottles like lifelines, ensuring they never again risked running out. In this way, the attempt to stop only reinforced dependence, making it more permanent. The situation created a strange contradiction in Georgian society. Laudanum was everywhere, in shops, in homes, in the hands of the rich and the poor alike. Yet at the same time, it was treated as something private, a matter not to be discussed. Families knew of the horrors of withdrawal, but they did not speak of them outside the home. Doctors saw the symptoms but did not publish warnings. The silence preserved the cycle. Addiction remained invisible as a public issue even while it destroyed lives in every neighborhood. There was also shame. To admit that someone in the family could not stop taking laudanum was to admit weakness, a flaw that reflected poorly on everyone. Instead of seeking help, which did not exist anyway, families tried to hide it. They invented excuses for the weakness of a husband, the fainting of a wife, the fragility of a child. Behind those excuses, bottles continued to pour their contents day after day. I think this silence shows how society can sometimes choose comfort over truth, preferring to hide what is too painful to acknowledge. The addict's dependence became absolute. They did not drink laudanum to feel better or to find visions anymore. They drank it to keep from falling apart. Every sip was a defense against collapse, not a pursuit of pleasure. This change marked the final stage of addiction. The drug no longer offered relief, it only delayed destruction. People spoke of their daily doses as if they were part of survival, like food or air. In a way, they were right. To stop was to risk death. This hopeless cycle spread through households across London. In wealthier homes, addicts lingered in fine rooms, surrounded by servants and silence, their bottles hidden in drawers. In poorer homes, addicts wasted away in crowded spaces, the drug bought in small amounts whenever money allowed. The pattern was the same, regardless of class. Laudanum was not a tool to live better. It was a chain that could not be broken. By this stage, even those who had once admired laudanum for its supposed inspiration could no longer pretend. Writers and poets who had praised it admitted to misery. Families who had trusted doctors realized too late what had happened. But nothing could change the fact that there was no cure, no path out, no hope for most. The drug demanded constant loyalty. The story of laudanum's hold was not just about individuals making poor choices. It was about a society that offered no warnings, no safeguards, and no care. Once addicted, people were left to endure or to die. To continue drinking was ruin. To stop drinking was worse. That was the trap, and it consumed thousands. The addict's body had already broken down, the mind had already wandered into illusions, and families had already suffered. Now, the final stage revealed itself complete entrapment, where there was no freedom, only the next dose. And from this point, the story of laudanum would grow even more cruel, as women in particular found themselves forced into roles as wives and mothers while still enslaved to the drug. In Georgian London, laudanum addiction was not recognized as an illness. Society treated it as weakness, fragility, or simply a private matter of health. For women, this ignorance carried an especially heavy weight. A woman addicted to laudanum was rarely given sympathy, and she was never excused from the roles expected of her. Marriage was considered her destiny, motherhood her duty. Addiction did not release her from these demands. On the contrary, many women were pushed into weddings and pregnancies even while their bodies were already collapsing under the grip of the drug. For families, a daughter's future was tied to the prospect of marriage. The presence of laudanum in her daily life did not alter this. Parents arranged matches, and society carried on as though nothing were wrong. Brides appeared at altars pale, trembling, their eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and drugged stupor. Yet these signs were explained away as delicacy or nerves. Husbands accepted wives who were already dependent, often without realizing the extent of it until after the vows. And once married, the expectation of children soon followed. Pregnancy under the influence of laudanum was devastating. The drug weakened women who were already frail, draining them of the strength needed to endure the burden of carrying a child. Some miscarried again and again, their bodies unable to sustain life. Others carried to term but found themselves too exhausted to withstand childbirth. The mortality rate among women in these situations was high, and yet few linked it to laudanum. Families mourned, but they explained the deaths as misfortune or the dangers of childbirth, never naming the true cause. It is almost grotesque that while society obsessed over female modesty and virtue, it ignored the bottles that drained the very life from women expected to uphold those ideals. Those who survived childbirth faced new struggles. Caring for an infant required energy, patience, and physical stamina, all of which were eroded by addiction. Mothers too weak to rise from bed tried to nurse their children while trembling and feverish. Some passed the drug through their milk, creating infants dependent from birth. Others left their children to the care of servants, unable to meet the demands of motherhood. The cries of babies echoed through hallways while mothers lay motionless, their bottles within reach. The image of maternal devotion was shattered by the reality of chemical enslavement. Husbands, too, were caught in the consequences. Some grew resentful, seeing their wives unable to fulfill domestic roles. Others indulged their wives' dependence, accepting laudanum as part of the household routine. In neither case was the drug confronted directly. Silence prevailed, and the cycle continued. Children grew up in homes where the mother's presence was shadowed by addiction. They learned early to fend for themselves, or they relied on servants to provide care. The bond of family weakened, and the household became a place of tension and decline. The wider society did not intervene. Doctors continued to prescribe laudanum to pregnant women, insisting it eased nerves or pain. They offered no warning, no caution, even when they saw the damage firsthand. When women collapsed after childbirth or wasted away during pregnancy, physicians recorded complications, not addiction. Their silence preserved the myth that laudanum was safe, even for expectant mothers. It reminds me of how dangerous medical authority can be when it cloaks harm in the language of care. For women themselves, there was little choice. Refusing marriage was rarely an option. and childlessness was viewed as failure. They were caught between societal duty and personal ruin, forced into roles they could not sustain. Laudanum did not excuse them from expectation. It only ensured that meeting those expectations would destroy them faster. Stories of women who died in childbirth or shortly after were so common that they hardly stirred shock. Each new grave was seen as another tragedy of female frailty, rather than a consequence of addiction fueled by medical negligence and social blindness. The tragedy was multiplied by secrecy. Families hid the truth, preferring to say that a daughter or wife had been delicate or nervous, rather than admit to dependence. Children grew up never knowing why their mothers were so weak, why their infancy had been marked by loss. Laudanum's role remained unspoken, its presence disguised behind polite words. The silence preserved reputations but destroyed lives. I cannot help but feel that this silence was a second cruelty, denying women even the dignity of having their true suffering recognized. What makes this history so haunting is how ordinary it all seemed at the time. Weddings continued, children were born, households carried on with their routines, while behind the curtains, women wasted away. The bottles sat on dressing tables, their contents swallowed morning and night, as natural to the rhythm of life as tea or bread. The damage was visible, but no one admitted it. Society demanded wives and mothers, and laudanum simply became part of the cost. For those who lived through it, the decline must have felt inevitable. A woman entered marriage already weakened, endured pregnancy with laudanum by her side, struggled to nurse or raise children, and often died young. The cycle repeated itself across households and generations. The expectation remained unchallenged. Women bore the burden silently, their lives shortened, their families fractured, their children scarred. In this way, laudanum not only destroyed individuals, it reshaped the very fabric of family life. It turned marriages into unions shadowed by sickness, motherhood into a path of suffering, and childhood into a memory of absence. The social order remained intact on the surface, but beneath, homes were hollowed out. Georgian society praised itself for refinement, yet behind its polished doors, laudanum consumed its wives and mothers. The addict's body had collapsed. Their minds had been haunted by visions. Their families had fallen into ruin, and women had been sacrificed to duty even as they wasted away. The story was not only one of medicine and addiction, it was one of silence, expectation, and cruelty disguised as normal life. And beyond the walls of the home, another consequence of laudanum was already spreading into the streets of London, as addiction drove some people into crime in their desperation to survive. By the time laudanum had carved its place into daily life, the damage was not confined to private rooms and silent families. It began to spill out into the streets. Addiction not only weakened bodies and breaks households, it also pushed many into desperate acts that brought them into conflict with the law. Crime linked to laudanum grew steadily in Georgian London, and though few spoke of it openly, the evidence appeared in police reports, court cases, and whispered gossip in the marketplaces. Addiction carries costs that could not always be met. When the bottle became the centre of life, people were willing to cross lines they would once have avoided. The most obvious crimes were theft. Laudanum was cheap compared to some luxuries, but for an addict, the need was constant. A few drops no longer sufficed. Larger amounts were required daily. For labourers who had lost their jobs, or for men whose wages barely covered rent and food, the cost quickly became unmanageable. Some stole from their employers, slipping coins from tills or tools from workshops to pawn for money. Others stole from family, taking silver spoons, trinkets, or jewellery, anything that could be sold. At first, the thefts were small, but as dependency deepened, desperation grew. Arrest records from the period contain cases of servants dismissed for theft, tradesmen caught pilfering goods, and women accused of stealing clothing. Many of these crimes were tied. though rarely admitted to the need for laudanum. For women, prostitution became another path. Addictions stripped away options, and the stigma attached to unemployment or poverty pushed them toward the streets. Some had once been respectable wives or daughters, but laudanum dulled shame and increased desperation. They sold their bodies to keep the flow of the drug steady, often earning just enough for another bottle. This cycle was brutal, pulling them deeper into both physical decline and social isolation. Their clients saw only the transaction, not the desperation behind it. Families that discovered such behavior often disowned these women, leaving them even more dependent on both prostitution and the drugs. It is grimly ironic that a society so quick to condemn immorality ignored the role laudanum played in driving women into it. Crimes committed in states of delirium or hallucination were also reported. Addicts in the grip of laudanum's visions sometimes lashed out violently, believing they were defending themselves or acting on commands no one else could hear. Some destroyed property, overturning tables, breaking windows, or setting fires in confusion. Others attacked neighbors or family members without provocation, driven by fear of imagined threats. Courts often label these individuals as mad rather than addicted, sending them to asylums or prisons without recognizing the role of laudanum. Their crimes were written down, but the cause remained hidden. The spread of crime tied to laudanum also revealed the inequality of Georgian London. Wealthier addicts rarely faced arrest. Their thefts were hidden within households, their prostitution disguised by money and status, their violent fits explained away as illness. Poorer addicts had no such protection. When they stole bread, clothing, or a few coins, they were dragged before magistrates and punished harshly. Their addiction was never considered in sentencing. The law saw only crime, not the chain that had led them there. It reminds me of how even today, the wealthy often find their addictions treated as medical problems, while the poor are punished as criminals. This double standard kept laudanum's true impact out of the public eye. The upper classes could maintain appearances, while the poor filled prisons and workhouses. But the connection was clear enough to those who looked closely. The rising tide of petty theft, prostitution, and sudden violence was not random. It followed the spread of laudanum, just as surely as broken families and wasted bodies did. The city itself reflected this shift. In alleys, women stood waiting for clients, their eyes dull, their movements unsteady. In taverns, men whispered of stolen goods, of pawned heirlooms, of coin earned by dishonest means. Police patrols noted the same faces reappearing, desperate for money, desperate for the bottle. London's growing population made it easier for such crimes to be hidden in plain sight, but the scale was undeniable. Laudanum had created a new kind of criminal, one not driven by greed or malice, but by the unbearable pull of addiction. Families tried to manage the shame by covering up these acts. A son caught stealing from neighbors might be sent away rather than prosecuted. A daughter found prostituting herself might be disowned quietly, her name never spoken again. Public reputation mattered too much for honesty. But within homes, the devastation was clear. Trust was destroyed, savings were lost, and futures were ruined. The link to laudanum was obvious to everyone involved, even if it was denied in public. Doctors, meanwhile, offered no help. Some even fueled the problem by continuing to prescribe laudanum to known addicts, profiting from their dependence. Others turned away, refusing responsibility once crime entered the picture. The system left addicts in a vicious cycle, condemned by society, ignored by medicine, and trapped by the drug. The silence around laudanum-related crime also reflected the larger silence of the era. To name the drug as a cause would have meant admitting its widespread use among the respectable classes. That was something Georgian London was unwilling to do. So instead, crimes were written down without explanation, and laudanum continued to flow. I think this silence created a deeper injustice, because it allowed the drug to remain blameless while people carried the entire burden of guilt. In truth, Crime was only one more symptom of a city drowning in addiction. It was the visible sign of desperation, the final stage when the body was failing, the family was broken, and the mind was haunted. To steal, to sell oneself, or to lash out violently was not simply a crime. It was evidence of how complete laudanum's hold had become. As the years went on, the connection between laudanum and rising crime became impossible to ignore. Newspapers began to hint at it, though rarely with open words. Clergy spoke of moral decline, though they did not name the drug. And the police filled their ledgers with names of men and women who might once have lived quiet lives but who now filled cells because of a bottle that society had placed in their hands. The addict's ruin had spread from body to mind, from family to society. Now it filled the streets with theft, with shame, with violence. The story of laudanum was no longer private. It was public, shaping the life of the city itself. And yet, even as crime rose, death from laudanum remained hidden in plain sight, disguised on paper and whispered about in silence. Death came often to laudanum addicts in Georgian London, yet when it arrived, it was rarely recorded honestly. Families, doctors, and even the state colluded, sometimes knowingly, out of habit, to cover the truth. The official causes written on death certificates were vague terms like heart failure, exhaustion, or nervous collapse. These words did not lie outright, but they concealed the central fact laudanum had drained life away. In this way, the reality of addiction was hidden from public record, and the true scale of the crisis remained invisible. Funerals for laudanum addicts were often swift and subdued. Families hurried the ceremonies, eager to place the matter behind them. Coffins were closed quickly, mourners kept to whispers, and priests read the same passages used for deaths by natural causes. No autopsies were performed. The idea of cutting open a body for examination was already rare, and when the death was linked to laudanum, it was avoided altogether. The drug that had hollowed out the body in life was denied the chance to be named in death. Shame played a powerful role. Addiction was not seen as an illness, but as a weakness or moral failing. To admit that a loved one had died from laudanum was to admit to disgrace. Families preferred to hide the truth, describing their relatives as delicate, overworked, or struck by sudden decline. In polite conversation, no one mentioned the bottles left behind on nightstands and mantels. Silence became a form of protection. It is almost bitterly comical that a society that tolerated laudanum on every street corner could not tolerate its name on a death certificate. Doctors encouraged this concealment. Some wrote death certificates themselves, choosing words that erased the drug from the story. Others stayed silent, unwilling to connect their own prescriptions to the grave now in front of them. By naming vague conditions, they avoided responsibility and allowed families to grieve without scandal. But this choice also meant that no public awareness could grow. Without records, without statistics, laudanum remained untouchable, its dangers unacknowledged. The pattern repeated across classes. In wealthy homes, the concealment was wrapped in dignity. Families held quiet funerals, draped rooms in black cloth, and spoke of exhaustion or failing health. In poorer homes, the process was cruder but no less silent. A body might be buried quickly in a parish graveyard, with little ceremony. Neighbours knew, but they did not speak. They had their secrets, their bottles hidden in cupboards. It reminds me of how today, families sometimes avoid naming addiction when speaking of a death, preferring softer words that hide the pain. This silence had lasting consequences. Without honest records, no one could measure how many lives laudanum claimed. The deaths piled up, but they appeared scattered and unrelated. Each was treated as an isolated tragedy rather than part of a wider crisis. The lack of accountability allowed apothecaries to continue selling freely and doctors to continue prescribing without pause. It also robbed victims of recognition. They were mourned as fragile souls, not as casualties of a powerful and destructive drug. Within households, The concealment deepened the suffering. Survivors carried the weight of knowledge but felt unable to share it. A wife who lost her husband to laudanum told neighbors he had died of weakness. Parents who buried a daughter whispered of poor health. Children grew up with half-truths, sensing that something was missing but never hearing it spoken. I find this silence crueler than open grief, because it denied the dead the truth of their suffering and left the living with secrets too heavy to carry. The burial rituals reinforced this pattern. Undertakers treated laudanum deaths like any other, preparing bodies without distinction. Clergymen avoided sermons that might address the issue, preferring to maintain respectability. Communities moved on quickly, each death becoming just another small note in the endless ledger of London's mortality. The drug remained hidden in plain sight, even as it lay at the root of countless funerals. In this way, laudanum's story was written not only in bottles and bodies, but also in omissions. What was not said mattered as much as what was. Each death certificate that avoided the word laudanum, each funeral that hurried past the truth, each family that chose silence over honesty, all contributed to the erasure of reality. The drug had killed, but society refused to admit it. This concealment explains why the scale of laudanum addiction remained underestimated for so long. Without statistics or open discussion, the drug was free to continue its quiet destruction. Generations passed without a reckoning. The city mourned endlessly, but it never asked the right questions. The cost of silence was measured in lives lost, year after year. The addict's collapse ended in the grave, but even there, the truth was hidden. Georgian society preferred to look away, to maintain appearances, to avoid the discomfort of naming what was right before them. And so the cycle of denial continued, generation after generation. The home, the family, the street, and now even the grave had been touched by laudanum. But beyond individual lives, society itself bore responsibility, because its silence was not accidental, it was chosen. And in that silence, laudanum continued to spread unchecked. Soon, we see how this silence expanded further, becoming a collective decision in which society treated addiction not as a crisis to confront, but as a private shame to be ignored. By the time laudanum had spread through every corner of Georgian London, the drug was no longer a private secret of individuals and families. It had become a public issue hiding in plain sight. Yet society responded not with regulation, not with debate, not even with recognition. Instead, there was silence. Addiction was treated as a matter of the household, not of the community. Each family carried its burden alone, and each avoided pointing at others for fear of exposing itself. The result was a city where laudanum destroyed thousands, but where no voice dared to name the destruction openly. The silence had practical reasons. Most families, whether wealthy or poor, had some relationship with laudanum. A mother took it for nerves, a father for pain, a child for sleep. To speak against the drug was to risk exposing one's dependence. Respectability mattered too much in Georgian society to allow such openness. Families preferred to pretend that laudanum was a private aid, not a public crisis. Neighbors avoided gossip because to criticize another household might invite questions about one's own. The secrecy of families became the secrecy of society itself. It almost feels like a comedy of manners, except that the cost was death and suffering hidden behind polite silence. Authorities shared in this silence. The police did not pursue laudanum use as a crime, and lawmakers never drafted regulations to restrict its sale. Apothecaries operated without oversight, doctors prescribed without limit, and advertisements ran in newspapers without hesitation. Officials saw no need to intervene. In part, this was because many of them also used laudanum or had relatives who did. In part, it was because addiction was not recognized as a category of illness or disorder. To them, laudanum was a medicine, and what happened in private homes was no business of the state. This refusal to regulate stood in sharp contrast to other areas of Georgian life, where rules governed everything from the weight of bread loaves to the conduct of street markets. Society valued order and law, but when it came to laudanum, there was nothing. The absence of rules gave the drug a unique place in daily life, dangerous enough to destroy, yet invisible in the eyes of the law. It reminds me of how some modern substances or practices slip through legal systems, not because they are harmless, but because society refuses to admit their danger. The effect of this silence was that addicts disappeared from public life. Families hid them away, keeping them indoors as their health declined. Neighbors saw less and less of them, until eventually they vanished altogether. Some were confined in bedrooms, others drifted into asylums under vague diagnoses. Others died quietly and were buried without mention of the drug. The streets of London did not fill with visible addicts because households absorbed the shame. Addiction became a hidden epidemic, devastating but largely unseen. This concealment allowed respectable society to continue its routines undisturbed. Balls were held, shops opened, and churches filled with parishioners. Behind the curtains, addicts wasted away, but the public surface remained orderly. Visitors to London could walk its streets without suspecting how many homes contained bottles of laudanum and the suffering they caused. Silence preserved appearances, and appearances mattered more than truth. There were occasional murmurs, of course. Clergymen preached vaguely about weakness or moral decline. Neighbors whispered about a family whose daughter had grown pale and withdrawn. Doctors shared private doubts with one another. But none of these voices rose above the hush. No one wanted to be the first to say aloud that laudanum was destroying the city, because to do so would mean admitting how close the destruction already was. The silence also prevented solidarity. Addicts and their families did not see themselves as part of a wider community facing the same problem. Each thought their suffering was unique, a private shame to be hidden. There were no groups, no gatherings, no exchange of experiences. Without recognition, there could be no support. Families endured in isolation, believing themselves alone even while thousands of others lived the same story. I find this isolation heartbreaking, because it meant that people who might have helped one another instead carried their burdens separately, multiplying the pain. The culture of silence extended even to art and literature. While some poets and novelists hinted at laudanum's role in their lives, most avoided confronting its darker truths. Works that mentioned it often romanticized its visions rather than exposing its cost. The public imagination preferred to see laudanum as exotic or mysterious, not destructive. This selective portrayal reinforced the idea that the drug was not a social threat but a private curiosity. The absence of regulation and conversation also meant that laudanum's grip lasted far longer than it might have otherwise. Without laws to limit sales or campaigns to warn of dangers, the drug continued to flow freely into homes for decades. Generations were touched by it, and yet no public record acknowledged its scale. The epidemic remained hidden, its victims buried under vague words and hurried funerals, its survivors silenced by shame. In the end, the silence of society was not neutral. It was a choice, one that protected reputations and comfort in the short term, but allowed destruction to spread in the long term. Georgian London preferred to look away rather than confront the truth. Families carried the burden, but the entire city was complicit. The addict's decline had moved from body to mind, from household to street, and finally into the collective silence of society itself. What had once been whispered within families became a shared agreement across London to ignore, to deny, to pretend. But silence could not erase history. The hidden deaths, the ruined families, the quiet crimes all left traces. And in time, those traces would form a legacy that revealed how deeply laudanum had scarred an entire century. By the end of the Georgian and well into the Victorian period, laudanum had left behind a legacy far greater than most recognized. For over 100 years, it shaped lives in silence, filling homes, shaping childhoods, weakening families and haunting minds. Yet when the history of London was written in those centuries, the role of laudanum was rarely mentioned. Official records did not name it, newspapers barely acknowledged it, and medical authorities minimized its importance. What remained was a hidden tragedy, spread across thousands of households, remembered only in whispers and in the ruins it left behind. Tens of thousands died as a direct result of laudanum use, but they were not remembered as victims of addiction. Death certificates carried vague labels like exhaustion or failure of the heart. Families buried loved ones quietly, keeping the shame to themselves. These men and women were erased from history, their true cause of death hidden behind silence. It almost feels like society preferred to write fiction on official papers rather than confront the truth written in suffering. Generations were touched by the drug. Parents passed their dependence to children, sometimes directly through nursing, other times indirectly through example. Sons grew up watching fathers rely on bottles to make it through the day. Daughters saw mothers collapse under the weight of doses prescribed as remedies. Many of these children carried the cycle forward, unable to imagine life without the drug that had always been present in their households. The epidemic did not begin and end with individuals. It stretched across time, knitting itself into family legacies. What made laudanum especially insidious was how normal it became. For over a century, it was treated as an ordinary part of life, as common as tea or bread. Apothecaries displayed it in windows, doctors recommended it, and households stored it alongside daily necessities. Because it was so widespread, it did not strike most people as unusual or dangerous. When nearly everyone used it, it became invisible as a problem. That invisibility allowed it to persist longer than almost any other drug epidemic in history. It reminds me of how modern society sometimes normalizes behaviors that, when seen in hindsight, appear shocking. Proof that what is common is not always safe. The physical legacy was carved into bodies. Archaeologists and historians now point to remains showing signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, and frailty that laudanum likely contributed to. Some pharaoh-like family trees in London carry genetic weakness not from bloodline marriages, but from generations weakened by constant drug use. Artists, writers, and labourers alike left behind works, diaries, and letters tinged with references to laudanum, sometimes romanticised, sometimes hinted at with regret. The drug left fingerprints everywhere, though rarely named. The cultural legacy was just as deep. Literature of the era carried images of dream-like visions, foggy melancholy, and fragile health. Poets who used laudanum wove its influence into their work, shaping public imagination. Readers were enchanted by the idea of otherworldly inspiration, never realizing how much suffering stood behind those words. Plays, novels, and poems reflected the haze of a drug-soaked society, but they rarely confronted the devastation directly. This selective memory shaped how later generations viewed the era, a time of refinement, beauty, and melancholy, with the darker truth carefully hidden. The silence of society left a wound in historical memory. Without open recognition, laudanum's victims were denied justice, their families denied acknowledgement. The tragedy became private rather than collective. Each household mourned alone, never realizing how many others shared the same pain. The result was a hidden epidemic whose scars were spread across the city but never gathered into one story. I think this is the greatest cruelty of laudanum's history. Not only the suffering itself, but the way it was erased, leaving victims unnamed and lessons unlearned for generations. When at last laudanum began to be recognized as a problem, it had already claimed countless lives. Only in the later 19th century did reformers, doctors, and legislators begin to discuss restrictions. By then, laudanum had been sold openly for over a century, creating an entrenched culture of use that was difficult to undo. Campaigns slowly arose, regulations were drafted, and substitutes were sought. But the damage was done. The century of silence had already passed, leaving behind broken families, lost lives, and a memory London did not want to carry. Yet memory has its way of lingering, even when suppressed. Ghost stories of Georgian houses often speak of pale figures in windows, silent women in dressing gowns, men wandering corridors with glassy eyes. Behind these legends may lie the truth of laudanum's victims, whose decline was never spoken of openly, but whose presence lingered in the imagination of the city. The fog of London streets, romanticized in literature, may also echo the haze of laudanum that clouded so many minds. The drug shaped not just individuals, but the very character of the city's image. The legacy also teaches us something unsettling about human nature. People can live alongside vast suffering and pretend not to see it if silence serves their comfort. Families can bury their dead and rewrite the story to protect reputations. Doctors can prescribe and ignore consequences. Authorities can refuse to regulate. All of this happened in London, and all of it allowed laudanum to thrive unchecked. The drug itself was destructive, but the silence around it was what gave it such power. Today, when we look back at Georgian and Victorian London, it is tempting to focus only on the glittering social scenes, the elegance of manners, or the literary genius of the era. But beneath that surface lay a hidden epidemic that consumed lives in silence. The polite veneer of society was bought at the cost of countless unspoken tragedies. To understand the true history, we must remember not only the beauty but also the suffering that was deliberately hidden. The story of laudanum ends not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow recognition, decades too late, of what had been happening all along. By the time restrictions came, an entire century had already been shaped by addiction. That legacy remains in the records of forgotten graves, in the faded lines of old poems, and in the hidden pain of families who carried their shame in silence. The addict's body wasted, the mind hallucinated, families collapsed, society looked away, and the grave concealed the truth. That was laudanum's century in London, a time when suffering was everywhere. But no one dared to speak it aloud, and even now, the memory lingers like a shadow over the city's past. So, as we close the story, let it be remembered not only as a chapter of history, but as a warning. Silence allows destruction to spread. Respectability can hide cruelty. What is normalized today may be condemned tomorrow. London's laudanum century shows us how entire societies can choose blindness, and how much it costs when they do. And with that, we end this long, haunting journey through the hidden life of a city addicted in silence. Thank you for staying with me through these pages of history. Sleep well tonight, and may your dreams be lighter than those that once haunted the addicts of Georgian London. Good night.